Tonight, before we begin, picture a man walking alone at the edge of a wood outside a great city, on a warm grey afternoon near the middle of his life. He is not tall, and he is not graceful, and his coat is a little too large and buttoned wrongly, and his dark hair stands up from his head as though the wind has been at it for years, though the air today is quite still. In one hand he carries a small notebook with a stub of pencil tied to it by a thread, and now and then he stops and stands very still in the long grass and writes something down, quickly, without looking at the page, his eyes fixed on the trees. Around him the world is full of sound. There is a brook running somewhere below the path, and there are birds in the hedges, and there is wind moving in the tops of the tall trees, and there are cattle lowing far off across the fields, and there is the small dry rustle of the grass against his boots. All of it is there. All of it is real, and he cannot hear any of it. Not the brook, not the birds, not the wind, not one single note of any of it. The world he is walking through is completely silent, has been growing more silent for years, and will one day be silent altogether. And yet inside that silence, hour after hour, day after day, in that little notebook with its stub of pencil, this half-deaf man is writing down some of the most glorious sound that human beings have ever made. Music that will still be filling concert halls and small rooms and passing cars and quiet headphones 200 years after his heart stops beating. That is where we are going tonight, into the long strange life of the man in the too large coat, and long before it, and long after it. But not yet. There is no hurry at all. There is nowhere we have to be. Settle now into whatever stillness you have managed to make for yourself tonight, wherever you are, whatever kind of day it has been. Let the room be as it is. Let the lamp grow dim, or let the screen dim itself and stay dim, and let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has pushed them, one quiet inch and then another quiet inch after that. You do not have to follow every word. You do not have to remember any of it. The words are only here to keep you company down the long soft slope into sleep, and if you drift off before we ever reach the great city, or the silence, or the notebook in the field, that is not a failure at all. That is exactly the point, and the story will still be here, patient and unhurried, waiting for you tomorrow night, and the night after that. If you enjoy these long quiet lives told slowly in the dark, you might, if you truly want to, and only if you truly want to, leave a like or follow along, because it does genuinely help other sleepless people find this little corner of the night. And if you feel like it, you might leave your town and your local time down in the comments before you drift off. Just a few words, because there is something gently comforting in knowing that all across the world, in all the different hours, other people are lying in the dark listening to the same slow voice and letting the same old story carry them down. That is all. That is the only asking there will be. Now let it all go, and let us begin, very slowly, a long way back from the man in the field, in a smaller town beside a wide grey river, more than 250 years ago. Before there was the deaf man in the coat, before there was the great city and the silence and the notebook, there was a town called Bonn, sitting low and comfortable on the western bank of the River Rhine, in the country we would now call Germany, though in those days it was nothing so tidy as a single country at all. It was a loose and sprawling patchwork of little states and bishoprics and free cities and princedoms, hundreds of them, all overlapping and quarrelling and marrying one another, and Bonn was the seat of one of the grander ones. It was the residence town of the Elector of Cologne, a prince who was also an archbishop of the Catholic Church, which meant he ruled both the souls and the taxes of the region, and who lived in a long pink palace with formal gardens running down toward the water. The town that grew up around that palace was a pleasant, modest, provincial sort of place. A few thousand people, red roofs and church spires and a market square, vineyards on the hills above, and barges moving slowly on the river below, carrying wine and coal and timber down toward the sea. It was not a famous town. It was not a place where the world expected anything remarkable to happen. It was the kind of town people were born in and lived in and died in, without the wider world ever quite noticing, and for most of its history that is exactly what it did. But a court, even a small provincial court, needs music. A great deal of music, and this is where our story truly begins. Because a court archbishop in those years needed music the way he needed candles and bread and clean linen. There was music for the Mass every single morning in the chapel, and music for the great feast days of the church calendar. And there was music at dinner, and music for dancing, and music for the birthdays and the name days of the prince and his relations, and music when important visitors came, and music simply to fill the long panelled rooms of the palace with something pleasant while the great, and the idle went about being great and idle. To make all this music the elector kept a small standing army of musicians on his payroll, singers and violinists and organists and horn players and the rest, and they were court servants like any other, wearing the court livery, drawing a modest salary, and passing their positions down, very often from father to son, the way a blacksmith or a baker passed down a trade. And into this small world of court musicians, a good while before our story properly starts, there came a man from far away who would give the family its name and its music both. He came from the Low Countries, from the region of Flanders, from the city of Mechelen in what is now Belgium, and he carried with him the little word that would one day be spoken in every concert hall on earth. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven. The name is Flemish, not German, which is why it does not sound quite like the names around it, and the small word van in the middle of it is worth pausing on for a moment, because it will matter later in ways this good man could never have guessed. In the Low Countries, van was simply a small word meaning of or from, a way of saying which family or which place a person came from, and it carried no rank at all, none whatsoever. It was not the German word von, which really did mean noble blood, a particle handed out by emperors, worn by barons and counts, the mark of the aristocracy. Van and von looked alike on the page to a careless eye, and sounded a little alike to a careless ear, and one day, a great many years after this first Ludwig was in his grave, that small careless resemblance would let the world believe, for a while, that his grandson was something grander than he was. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is no hurry, none at all. This first Ludwig, the grandfather, came to Bonn as a young man to sing, for he had a fine, strong bass voice, and he was clever and steady and ambitious in the quiet way of a man who means to rise, and rise he did. He sang in the court chapel, and he taught, and he made himself useful, and in time he was appointed Kapellmeister, which was the very top of the whole musical household. The master of all the court's music, the man who ran the choir and the orchestra and answered directly to the prince. For a court musician there was no higher place to reach, and he reached it, and he kept it, and by all the accounts that come down to us, he was a dignified, respected, warm-hearted man, well-liked in the town, comfortable, secure, the very picture of a life well and soberly built. There is a portrait of him that survived, and his grandson kept it on the wall wherever he lived for the whole of his own restless life, moving it from lodging to lodging across a great city. This one steady old face looking out from the amber dark, a grandfather he had barely known, holding up before him the image of the solid, respectable, accomplished man the family had once produced, and perhaps might produce again. The old Kapellmeister had, however, one deep sorrow running quietly under his comfortable life, and it was this. His wife, a woman he seems to have loved, drank. She drank steadily and secretly, and then not so secretly, and in the end she had to be sent away to live in a religious house. A kind of gentle confinement, because she could not be trusted at home, and this was the great private grief of the grandfather's respectable years. It matters to our story, because that thirst, that particular family shadow, did not stop with her. It ran on down into the next generation like a dark thread pulled through cloth, and it landed on the couple's surviving son, a boy named Johann, and it would shape and very nearly ruin the childhood of the small grandson who was still years from being born. Johann van Beethoven, the father, was a musician too, because of course he was, because in that family and in that court, what else would a boy be? He had grown up in the palace world, and he had a pleasant enough light tenor voice, and he took his place among the court singers as his father had done before him, and there on the surface of things was another respectable court musician carrying on the family trade. But Johann was not his father. He did not have the older man's steadiness or his patience or his quiet strength of will. He was a lesser talent and a weaker character, a man of small gifts and large appetites, and the family thirst had come down to him in full measure. He drank, and as the years went on he drank more, and drink made him unreliable and then quarrelsome, and then, in the worst years, cruel, and he never in his whole life climbed any higher than the middling place he started in, and watched, we may imagine, with a sour and swelling resentment, as his own great father's name grew fainter in the town, and his own prospects shrank. This, then, is the household we are slowly walking toward, down the long soft slope of the years, a famous beloved grandfather already dead or dying, remembered as the family's great man, a father who was a disappointment to himself most of all, drinking away his small talent in the taverns of Bonn. And, very soon now, into that narrow house on a narrow street, a child, a particular child, who would carry the grandfather's very name and the father's very trade, and the family's dark thirst waiting in the blood, and something else besides. Something no one in that house, or that town, or that whole patchwork country had the faintest idea was coming. The child was born in the middle of December, in the year 1770, in a small room in a house on a street called the Bongasse, in that town of Bonn beside the wide grey Rhine. We do not know the exact day he was born, which is a strange thing to say about one of the most famous people who ever lived, but it is true, because in those years and in that place a birth was not what got written down. What got written down was the baptism, the bringing of the child to the church to be received into the Christian faith, and the parish register of the Church of St. Remigius records that a child named Ludwig, son of Johann van Beethoven, and his wife Maria Magdalena, was baptized on the 17th day of December, 1770. The custom of the time and place was to baptize a baby within a day or two of its birth, because so many babies died so quickly, and so the family always believed, and the man himself always believed, that he had been born on the 16th of December, the day before, and that is the day the world has agreed to remember, though the truth is simply that he came into the world in the middle of that cold December week, and no one thought to note down precisely when. He was not, in fact, the first child of that name in the house. There had been a baby born the year before, also a boy, also named Ludwig, after the grandfather, and that first little Ludwig had lived only 6 days and then died, as babies so often did, and been buried, and the grief of him folded quietly away. And so when the next son came, the following winter, they gave him the same name again, the grandfather's name, the great man's name, reaching for it a second time, and this time the child lived. There is something in that, if you like to look for such things, in a man carrying the name of a dead brother he never knew, given a second time as though the family were determined the name should not be wasted, and it is the sort of small, sad, ordinary fact that filled a great many households in those years, when to raise a child to grown age at all was a thing no parent could take for granted. Of the children that Johann and Maria Magdalena went on to have, most did not live. Only 3 of all of them reached adulthood, and Ludwig was the eldest of those 3, the eldest surviving son, with 2 younger brothers who lived, Caspar Karl and Nicolaus Johann, born a few years after him, and these 2 brothers would stay tangled up in his life, for better and very often for worse, until the very end of it. The mother, Maria Magdalena, is a quiet figure in the story, and a gentle one, and by every account the one warm thing in that cold narrow house. She had not had an easy life even before she married Johann. She was the daughter of a cook at another little court, she had married young, she had been widowed young, she had lost a first husband and a first baby before she ever came to Bonn and married into the Beethoven family, and by the time her famous son was old enough to remember her, she was already a worn, quiet, serious woman, often unwell, rarely seen to laugh. Her son remembered her all his life with a deep and simple tenderness. He remembered her as patient and long-suffering and kind, the one who held the household together while his father came apart, and long after she was dead he would speak of her as his best friend, and mean it, and there is a letter he wrote as a young man in which he calls her exactly that, his best friend, and grieves that she did not live to see him make anything of himself. So that was the warmth in the house. The cold in the house was the father. Johann van Beethoven looked at his small son, and somewhere in those early years, watching the boy at the keyboard, he saw something. And what he saw was not really the child at all. What he saw was money, and rescue, and a way out of his own failure, because all across Europe in exactly those years there was one story on everybody's lips, one dazzling example that every musical father in every provincial town had heard about and turned over in his mind, and that was the story of the little Mozart. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, born only 14 years before our Ludwig, had been a miracle child, a tiny boy of 4 and 5 and 6 who could play anything, write anything, astonish anyone, and whose father had taken him by coach all across the courts of Europe, to Vienna and Paris and London, showing him off before empresses and kings, and being paid, and being celebrated, and lifting the whole family up on the strength of one small, extraordinary child. Every musical father in Germany had that story in his head, glittering and impossible, and Johann van Beethoven, sliding down into drink and debt and disappointment, looked at his own small, serious, dark-eyed son, picking out notes on the court harpsichord, and decided with the desperate certainty of a drowning man that here was his own little Mozart, his own miracle, his own way up and out. And so the lessons began, and they were not kind. Johann set about turning his small son into a prodigy the way a man might set about breaking a horse, by force and by fear and by endless grinding hours. He drilled the boy at the keyboard and at the violin, on, far past the point of tiredness, far past the point of tears. And the neighbours in the Bongasse remembered for the rest of their lives the sight of the very small child standing on a little footstool to reach the keys of the clavier, playing and playing while his father stood over him, and they remembered the sound of the boy crying as he played. Worst of all were the nights. Johann would come home from the taverns late, drunk, sometimes with a drinking friend in tow, another court musician as far gone as himself, and he would haul the sleeping child out of his bed in the dark and stand him at the keyboard and make him play for them, for hours, into the small hours of the morning, so that a growing boy who needed his sleep was robbed of it again and again by a drunken father showing off his investment to a drunken friend. It was a hard, frightening, loveless way to teach a child music, and it is a small miracle, and a sign of something very deep and very stubborn already alive in the boy, that it did not make him hate music for the rest of his days. It did not. Somehow, underneath the fear and the crying and the stolen sleep, the child fell in love with the thing itself, with the sound and the making of the sound, quite apart from the cruelty that surrounded the learning of it, and that love, once it took root in him, never once let go for the whole of his life. Johann's grand plan, in the narrow money-minded terms he had dreamed it, did not really work. He did try to launch his little Mozart. When the boy was 7 years old, his father arranged a public concert in the nearby city of Cologne, and put the child on the bill to play, and here we come to one of those small-telling dishonesties that hang about the father like a smell of stale wine. On the printed announcement for that concert, Johann advertised his son as being 6 years old, not 7, shaving a year off the child's real age to make the prodigy seem younger and therefore more astonishing, more Mozart-like. It was a small lie, a showman's lie, but it had a strange long consequence, because the boy himself grew up believing the false age, or half believing it, and for a good part of his life the grown man was genuinely confused and uncertain about how old he actually was, so that even his own birth year became a small, foggy, uncertain thing to him, thanks to a father's cheap advertising trick. The Cologne concert did not make the family's fortune. The wider world did not come running. There was no grand tour of the courts of Europe, no empresses, no rain of gold. Johann simply did not have his own father's steadiness, or the elder Mozart's tireless cunning to manage such a thing, and the drink was eating more of him every year. So the miracle child scheme quietly failed, as most of Johann's schemes quietly failed, and the boy was left where he had started, in the small town, in the narrow house, at the same keyboard, except that now he could genuinely, remarkably play. Because the strange thing, the thing that redeems this grim beginning a little, is that the brutal method had in its way worked, not as the get-rich scheme the father dreamed of, but in the only way that finally mattered. The boy could play. By the time he was 10 or 11 years old, he was already a serious musician, not a trained monkey but a real and growing artist, and other people, better people than his father, began to notice. The person who noticed most, and who mattered most, was a man named Christian Gottlob Niefe, and he arrived in Bonn to take up a post at the court when Ludwig was about 10 years old, and he became, quietly and without any fuss, the first real teacher the boy ever had. Which is to say, the first teacher who taught him out of care rather than out of greed. Niefe was the court organist, a thoughtful, serious, cultivated man, a composer himself, a man of the new ideas that were moving through Europe in those years, ideas about reason and feeling and the dignity of the ordinary person, and he took the strange, fierce little Beethoven boy under his wing and began to teach him properly. Not just the fingers on the keys, but the whole great inheritance of music. He set the boy to studying the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, the towering old master of the keyboard, whose vast collection of preludes and fugues Niefe used as a kind of Bible of the art, and the boy devoured them and learned to play them, and something in that rigorous, endless, God-shaped music went deep into him and stayed there for good. Niefe taught him composition, how to build a piece of music from the ground up, how to write it down, how to think in the long shapes of it. And Niefe did something else, something a lesser or a meaner teacher would never have done. When the boy was still only 11 or 12 years old, Niefe let him serve as his deputy. Let him sit at the great organ in the court chapel and play the services when the master himself was away or unwell, so that this half-grown child was, for stretches, effectively the organist of the whole court, and later Niefe helped him get his first small paid position in the court music, an assistant's post, so that the boy became a wage-earning court musician, while he was still very young indeed. And Niefe went further still. He wrote about his pupil, in print, in a music journal that circulated among the learned musical people of the German lands, and he described this young Ludwig van Beethoven, and he said, in so many words, that if the boy went on as he had begun, he would surely become a second Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It is one thing for a drunken father to shout that his son is the new Mozart in a tavern. It is quite another for a respected, serious, sober court musician to write it down calmly in a national journal for all his colleagues to read. That was the first time the wider world heard the name, printed in a magazine by a man who knew what he was talking about, and it was Niefe who gave the boy that first push out into the light, and the man Beethoven never forgot it. Years later, grown and famous and far away, he wrote to his old teacher and thanked him, and said that if he ever became a great man, it would be partly Niefe's doing, and that is a rare and gracious thing for a proud, difficult man to say, and he meant it. So by his early teens the boy had a trade, and a wage and a great teacher and a growing name, and a family that leaned on him harder every year as the father sank. And then, when he was 16 years old, the court, or perhaps his own growing ambition, or perhaps some patron whose name is lost to us, arranged the thing that every serious young German musician dreamed of. They sent him to Vienna. Vienna, far to the south and east, on the Danube, was the great musical capital of the whole German-speaking world, and of half of Europe besides. It was the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor, a vast glittering imperial city stuffed full of palaces and opera houses and churches and salons, where the aristocracy competed with one another to keep the finest music and the finest musicians, and where at that very moment. In that spring of 1787, the greatest living composer in the world, was living and working, and his name was Mozart. And so the 16-year-old Ludwig van Beethoven travelled all the long way south to Vienna, most likely, in the hope of studying with the very man he had been compared to since he was a child. What actually happened in Vienna on that first visit is one of the great tantalising mysteries of his whole life, because the records are thin to the point of vanishing, and almost everything anyone has ever said about it is a story told long afterward by people who were not there. The one thing that seems reasonably sure is that the boy did somehow come into the presence of Mozart. That the two of them, the reigning master of 31 and the unknown boy of 16, were in a room together at least once. There is a much-loved story, told years later and impossible now to prove or disprove, that the boys sat down and played for Mozart, and that Mozart, thinking it was a memorized showpiece and only politely impressed, was unmoved. Until the boy asked to be given a theme to improvise upon, a few notes to build something new from on the spot, and that when the boy took that theme and spun it out into something extraordinary, wandering and building and astonishing, Mozart went quietly into the next room, where some friends were talking, and told them to pay attention to this young man, because one day he would give the world something to talk about. It is a lovely story. It may even be true. We simply cannot know. What we do know is that the visit was cut cruelly short. He had been in Vienna only about 2 weeks, only just arrived, only just begun whatever he had come to begin, when word reached him from home that his mother was gravely ill, and he had to turn around at once and make the whole long journey back north to Bonn. And he reached her, and she was dying, and in the middle of that summer of 1787 she died, of the wasting lung disease that carried off so many in those years, and the one warm, gentle, steady thing in the boy's whole life was gone. He was 16 years old. He had lost his best friend, as he called her, the only real shelter he had ever had, and he came home from the bright far city to a house that now had no mother in it, and a father who was drinking harder than ever, spinning down toward the bottom, and 2 younger brothers, still children, who needed feeding and clothing and watching over, and no one at all left to do it but him. And so the boy became, in every way that mattered, the head of the household, while he was still a boy himself. It is one of the quiet, heavy, defining facts of his whole life, and everything harsh and everything strong in the grown man grows partly out of it. Within a couple of years the father had fallen so far, was so lost to drink, so unreliable, so close to a public scandal, that the court had finally to step in and do something extraordinary. There is a document, and it is a painful thing to read across the centuries, in which arrangements were made for half of the father's salary to be paid not to the father at all, but directly to the son, to young Ludwig, so that the money might actually reach the family and buy food and pay the rent, instead of vanishing across a tavern counter. A boy of 18 or 19, made the legal keeper of his own father's wages, made responsible for his own father's failure, made the true father of his own 2 younger brothers. He never wrote much about those years afterward. He was not a man who complained in words about his own suffering, ever, but you can feel the shape of those years pressing on everything he became, on the fierce independence of him, the refusal to lean on anyone, the deep, protective, almost desperate love he carried all his life for his brothers, the sense he seems always to have had that he alone must hold the whole weight up, or everything would fall. He had learned, far too young, that the people who were supposed to protect him could not, and that if anything at all was going to be held together, he would have to be the one to hold it, and he carried that lesson like a stone in the chest for the rest of his days. And yet, through all of it, the music never stopped. That is the thing to hold on to here, as the household darkened and the father sank. Through the dying mother and the drinking father and the 2 hungry brothers, and the borrowed money and the endless grinding worry of it all, the young man kept playing, and kept composing, and kept growing as an artist, faster and stronger than anyone around him quite realized. He played viola in the court orchestra now, sitting in the middle of the sound, learning from the inside how all the instruments fit together. He played the organ in the chapel. He gave lessons to the children of the well-off families of Bonn, and through those lessons he began, for the first time, to be welcomed not as a servant, but as a guest into cultivated, kindly, book-loving households, where he met young people his own age who read poetry and argued about ideas and treated him as an equal and a friend, and where, for really the first time in his life, he was warm and safe and valued. The house that mattered most to him in those Bonn years was the house of a widow named von Breuning, a warm, cultivated family of a mother and several children not far from his own age, and he came into that house first as a music teacher for the younger ones and stayed as something much closer to a member of the family. The widow von Breuning seems to have understood the strange, fierce, lonely boy at once, and to have been endlessly patient with his moods, and to have given him, gently and without ever making a show of it, some of the mothering he had lost, drawing him out of his black tempers, teaching him a little how to be among gentle people, opening her shelves of poetry and philosophy to him. It was in that house that he first fell deeply in love with reading, with the great German poets who were then setting the whole country alight, with the old plays of the Greeks and the newer plays of his own age, with the high-ringing ideas of freedom and nature and the brotherhood of all people that were sweeping across Europe in those years like a wind before a storm. He never had a real formal education, this man, hardly any schooling at all, taken out of the little local school young to be a working musician, weak in his spelling and his sums to the end of his days. But he made himself, in that warm house and for the rest of his life, into a passionate self-taught reader. And the ideas he found there, the great burning ideas of human dignity and freedom, went as deep into him as the music of Bach had, and stayed as long, and shaped everything he would one day try to say and sound. And it was around this table too that he met a young man who would become one of the truest friends of his whole life. A slightly older student of medicine named Franz Wegler, steady and kind and loyal, who would still be his friend and correspondent decades later at the very end, one of the small handful of people who knew him young and never let go. So these Bonn years were not all darkness. There was the darkness at home, yes, the father, the worry, the weight. But there was also, growing up right beside it, a widening world of warmth and friendship and ideas, and, above all, of music pouring out of him now, in real and serious quantity. He was writing songs and variations and pieces for the piano and chamber music, and a couple of grand, solemn, ceremonial works too. And though most of this early music is not what the world remembers him for, it was the honest apprentice work of a real and rapidly growing master, and the people around him could feel the pressure of it building, the sense of something large gathering itself, something that this small, comfortable provincial court could not possibly contain. Everyone who knew him knew he would have to leave. Bonn was too small for what was coming. And then, when he was about 21 years old, the door opened. The greatest of all the older German composers, Joseph Haydn, the kindly, celebrated, universally beloved old master, the man who had more or less invented the modern symphony and the string quartet as the world now knew them, passed through Bonn on his way home to Vienna from a triumphant journey to London. He stopped at the court, he was feted and dined, and somewhere in the course of that visit the young Beethoven's music was put before him, and Haydn was impressed. Impressed enough to say that the young man should come to Vienna and study with him. That was the key turning in the lock, an invitation from Haydn himself, the most famous musician alive now that Mozart was gone. For Mozart had died, suddenly and young, only the year before, at just 35, leaving the whole musical world stunned, and the great throne of Vienna, so to speak, standing empty. The Elector of Bonn agreed to keep paying the young man's salary while he went south to study, treating it as a kind of investment, sending his promising court musician off to be finished by the great master, and then, presumably, to come home again polished and improved. And so, in the last days of the year 1792, a few weeks before his 22nd birthday, Ludwig van Beethoven packed up his few belongings, and said his goodbyes, and climbed into a coach, and set out on the long road south to Vienna. He would live for another 35 years. He would become the most famous composer in the world. he would never once, in all those 35 years, come home to Bonn again. He did not know that, of course, as the coach pulled away. Nobody ever knows that. He thought he was going away to study for a while and then return, but the truth, rolling toward him unseen down the years, was that he was leaving his whole first life behind for good. The river and the little town and the pink palace and the narrow house, and setting his face toward the great city that would hold the whole rest of his story. In the little notebook he carried with him, friends and well-wishers had written farewell messages, the kind of thing friends write, and one of them, written by a thoughtful young nobleman of the town named Count Waldstein, has come down to us and is worth carrying with you into the dark tonight, because it turned out to be so strangely exactly right. Waldstein wrote that Beethoven was travelling to Vienna to fulfill a long-held wish, and that Mozart's genius was still mourning and weeping over the death of its owner, and that if the young man worked hard and without ceasing, he might receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. Receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. It was a graceful thing to write to a departing friend, a bit of high-flown encouragement, and it turned out to be one of the truest prophecies anyone ever made, though not at all in the smooth way it was meant, because the studying with Haydn would not go smoothly at all. The road south took a week or more, over rough tracks, through country that was beginning to shake with the first tremors of enormous events, for far to the west, in France, a revolution had broken out 3 years before. The King of France was a prisoner of his own people, the old order of Europe was cracking, and within weeks of Beethoven's arrival in Vienna, that French king would be dragged to a public square and beheaded before a crowd, and all the crowned heads of Europe would go to war against the revolution in a terror of contagion. The young man rolling toward Vienna in his coach was travelling straight into the eye of the most turbulent half-century in the history of Europe, an age of revolution and war and emperors rising and falling, and all of that upheaval. All those armies and ideals and thrones would wash back and forth across his own life again and again, and feed in the strangest way straight into his music. But he did not know that either. He knew only that he was young, and free at last of the little town, and armed with a real gift and a fierce will, and an invitation from the greatest master alive, and that the great city was waiting for him at the end of the road, glittering and enormous and full of everything he had ever wanted. He arrived in Vienna in the second week of November, 1792. He was not quite 22 years old. He had a little money, a few names of people to call on, a trunk of belongings, and inside him, still folded up and waiting, more music than the world had heard from any one human being in a very long time. And Vienna, that winter, had no idea at all what had just walked in through its gates. Almost as soon as he arrived, word came from Bonn that his father had died. Johann van Beethoven, the drinking tenor, the failed showman, the ruined father, was gone in the December of that same year, only a few weeks after his son left home, and there is something almost too neat about it. The father dying just as the son escaped, as though the old life let go of him the moment he was clear of it. Beethoven did not go back for the funeral. There was, in truth, not a great deal to go back for, and the salary the court had been paying, part to the father and part to the son, now needed sorting out, and the young man in Vienna wrote the necessary letters and kept the money coming, and did not, so far as we can tell, grieve very loudly. The court in Bonn, hearing the father was dead, remarked dryly in an official note that the revenues from the liquor tax would now presumably suffer, which is the kind of joke a bureaucracy makes about a man who has drunk himself to death, and it is about the coldest epitaph a person could have, and it was very nearly all the mourning Johann got. So there he was, the young Beethoven, in the great city, with both his parents dead and his brothers left behind in Bonn, alone and free and entirely on his own 2 feet for the first time in his life, and he set about, with a kind of ferocious energy, becoming somebody. He went to Haydn for his lessons, as arranged, and this is where the smooth story of the master handing on the torch turns out to be a good deal bumpier than the pretty legend. Haydn was old now, and famous, and comfortable, and enormously busy, and a genial, easygoing soul who was not really cut out to be a strict schoolmaster to a difficult young man in a hurry. And Beethoven was difficult, and in a hurry, and proud, and prickly, and privately convinced, probably rightly, that on some level he already knew things the old man was not teaching him. He dutifully brought his exercises, and Haydn looked them over, kindly but not always carefully, and missed things, and Beethoven noticed that he missed things, and quietly, behind the old man's back, he arranged for a second teacher, a rigorous, dry, thorough theory master named Johann Georg Albrechtsberger, to drill him privately in the strict old rules of counterpoint, the deep grammar of music, so that he could get the real training he felt Haydn was too busy and too grand to give him. He studied vocal writing on the side with none other than Antonio Salieri, the court composer, a real and generous musician whatever the later slanders made of him. So the young man was, in effect, gathering up his whole education for himself, taking a little from each of the great men, and trusting, underneath it all, chiefly to himself. He and Haydn never became close. There was too much pride on the one side, and too much easy grandeur on the other, and a coolness grew between them that never quite healed, though in later years Beethoven softened toward the old man's memory, and admitted, as he had admitted about Nife, that he had learned real things from him after all. But the torch in the end was not so much handed on as seized. That was the way this man did most things in his life. He seized them. Because the thing that truly launched him in Vienna was not the lessons at all. It was his playing. When Ludwig van Beethoven sat down at a piano in a great Viennese drawing room, something happened that people who were there spent the rest of their lives trying to describe. He was, by every surviving account, one of the most overwhelming performers anyone had ever heard, and above all one of the greatest improvisers who has perhaps ever lived. A man who could be handed a scrap of a tune, a few notes hummed by a stranger, and would then sit and build from it, out of nothing, in the moment, whole vast structures of music, tender and stormy and grand and heartbreaking by turns, going on for a quarter of an hour, half an hour, holding a whole room full of jaded aristocrats utterly silent and often, quite literally, in tears. People wept when he improvised. Hardened worldly music lovers who had heard everything wept, and then were half ashamed of it, and he, it must be said, rather enjoyed reducing them to that state and then laughing at them for it, because he had a rough streak and a wicked sense of humour, and not much patience with the airs of the fashionable. The Viennese aristocracy, who prized fine music above almost anything, and competed with one another to possess the newest wonder, fell upon this astonishing young pianist from the provinces, and took him up, and passed him from palace to palace, and this is the thing that must be understood about how his life now worked, because it is so unlike how a musician lives today. There was no such thing yet as a career made from selling tickets to the public, or records to strangers. A serious musician lived, instead, by patronage, by the favour and the purses of the great noble families, who would take a gifted man up, give him rooms or a yearly allowance, or rich fees for lessons and private concerts, and wear him, in a sense, as an ornament of their household, the way they wore fine horses and French cooks and Italian paintings. And Beethoven, difficult and proud as he was taken up by the very grandest of them, by princes and counts with names that filled the almanac of the nobility, the Lichnowskis, the Lobkowitzes, the Kinskis, the Razumovskis, the Waldsteins, men of immense wealth who gave him money and lodging and instruments, and above all, the free run of their music rooms and their orchestras, so that he had, from very early on, the extraordinary luxury of hearing his own new works played by fine players almost as soon as the ink was dry. Prince Lichnowsky in particular more or less adopted him, gave him rooms in his own palace, settled a yearly income on him, treated him almost as a son. It should have been the sweetest arrangement in the world for a poor young man from nowhere, and in every practical way it was. And yet here we come up against the very strangest and most important thing about Ludwig van Beethoven, the thing that separates him from every great musician who had come before him, and it is this. he would not be a servant. In the whole long tradition he was born into, a musician, even the very greatest, even Bach, even Haydn, even Mozart, was a servant, a member of the household staff, who wore a livery and ate below the salt, and bowed to his masters, and wrote the music his masters ordered on the terms his masters set. That was simply what a musician was, a superior sort of servant, and everyone accepted it, and had accepted it for centuries. Beethoven did not accept it, and never would, not for a single day of his life, and he made this plain from very early on, with a bluntness that scandalized and secretly thrilled the aristocrats around him. He came to Vienna already full of the burning revolutionary ideas he had drunk in at the von Breuning table in Bonn, the great new notion, then setting the whole world on fire, that a man's worth lay in what he was and what he did, and not one jot in the accident of his birth, that a peasant of genius was 1,000 times the better of a duke of nothing, that all men were equal in their essential dignity. He believed that, fiercely and to the bone, and he applied it, without the slightest hesitation, to himself, and he behaved, in the drawing-rooms of the highest nobility in Europe, not as their servant, and not even quite as their equal, but very nearly as their superior. A natural aristocrat of talent moving among mere aristocrats of blood. And he let them feel it. He kept them waiting. He refused to play when he did not feel like playing. He flew into rages at the smallest slight and stormed out. He said outrageous, cutting things, and did not apologize for them. And the astonishing part, the part that tells you how the world was quietly changing, is that they took it. They put up with him. They courted him and forgave him, and came back for more. Because his gift was so overwhelming that the ordinary rules seemed simply to bend around him, and because, deep down, this new idea of the artist as a kind of sacred force answerable to nothing but his own genius was an idea whose time had come, and Beethoven was its first and fiercest and most convincing embodiment. There is a famous glimpse of him in these years striding through the fashionable world like a force of nature, and it comes from the piano duels, which were one of the great entertainments of musical Vienna. It was the custom, when a celebrated visiting pianist came to town, for the local great families to arrange a kind of contest, a musical duel, between the newcomer and the reigning local champion, the two of them taking turns at the instrument before a room full of connoisseurs, playing set pieces and then improvising, trying to outdo one another in brilliance and invention and sheer overwhelming power, while the audience judged. Beethoven was thrown into several of these contests against the finest travelling virtuosos of the day, dazzling fashionable players with famous names, and he demolished them, everyone, not always politely. He would let his opponent finish some glittering, delicate, carefully prepared showpiece, and then he would sit down and take a theme, sometimes deliberately snatching up the music his rival had just played, and turning it upside down and inside out, and making something colossal of it, and simply bury the man under an avalanche of inventions so far beyond anything the poor fellow could answer that the contests often ended with the challenger quietly leaving town, and at least one of them, a proud and gifted young pianist, is said to have been so shattered by the experience that he could hardly bear to touch a keyboard for some time afterward. It was not kind. Beethoven was not, in these years, a kind man in competition, but it built his legend faster than any amount of composing could have done, and within a very few years of arriving unknown from the provinces he was, by common consent, the greatest pianist in Vienna, which meant very nearly the greatest pianist in the world. And all the while, underneath the dazzling performer, the composer was steadily, patiently building. He was careful at first about what he let the world see. He had been in Vienna for a few years and was already famous as a player before he was willing to put out as his official first work his Opus 1, a set of 3 trios for piano, violin and cello. Music he had polished and repolished until he was sure it could stand. He knew the eyes of the musical world were on him, waiting to see whether the astonishing improviser could really compose, whether there was lasting substance behind the fireworks, and he was determined that the answer, when it came, should be beyond argument. And it was. The early works came out one after another through the 1790s and into the new century, and each one raised him higher, sets of piano sonatas, string trios and quartets, concertos he wrote to play himself. And the world began to understand that here was not merely a great performer, but a great composer, perhaps the coming great composer of the age. Among the piano sonatas of these years was one he himself called the Grand Sonata Pathétique, the pathetic sonata, meaning full of pathos, full of deep feeling, and its slow movement, a melody of the most aching, tender simplicity floating over a gently rocking accompaniment, became so beloved so quickly that it was played in drawing rooms all across Europe, and is still, today, one of the most instantly recognizable pieces of music in the world, one of those melodies that people who know nothing whatever about Beethoven find they somehow already know. He was in his late 20s. He was rich, or rich enough, comfortable, celebrated, courted, at the very centre of the musical life of the greatest musical city on earth, with the whole future opening before him like a lit road. He had climbed all the way up out of the narrow house by the Rhine, out of the crying child on the footstool and the drunken father in the night. And he had done it in a handful of years by the sheer, overwhelming force of his gift and his will. And everything, absolutely everything, seemed to be his. And it was exactly then, at the very height of that first golden rising, that he began, in the secret places of his own body, to go deaf. It came on slowly and quietly, and at first he tried with all his might to pretend it was not happening. The first signs were small and easy to explain away, a ringing and humming and buzzing in his ears that would not stop, worse at some times than others, and a difficulty in company in catching the higher tones of speech so that words spoken softly, or from across a room, or by a voice that was not deep, began to blur and slip past him. For a while a man can tell himself it is a cold, or tiredness, or some passing trouble that will clear. But it did not clear. It crept, month by month and year by year, always in the one direction, and slowly, with a mounting private terror that he hid from nearly everyone, Ludwig van Beethoven came to understand the one thing that could not be true, the one catastrophe that of all the catastrophes in the world was the most impossible, the most grotesque, the most unbearable, for a man who was, before he was anything else on this earth, a musician. He was losing his hearing, the one sense he could not lose, the sense that was not merely how he made his living, but how he touched the whole of reality, how he knew the world, how he was himself. A painter who goes blind, a terrible thing, has at least lost the tool of his trade. But music does not even exist except as sound, as vibration in the living ear, and here was the greatest musician of the age, not yet 30, feeling the sound of the world draw slowly back from him like a tide going out, and knowing, with a horror we can hardly begin to imagine, that it was never ever coming back in. For a long time he told almost no one. He was terrified, above everything, that if it became known that Beethoven was going deaf, it would be the end of him. The end of the performing, the end of the reputation, the end of the whole life he had built, that people would pity him or laugh at him or quietly drop him, that the aristocrats would find another wonder and move on. So he hid it, with enormous and exhausting effort, for years. He avoided conversations he could no longer follow. He pretended to be lost in thought or moody or absent-minded, when the truth was he simply had not heard. He withdrew more and more from the social evenings he could no longer manage, and let people think him rude or eccentric or arrogant, rather than let them guess the real reason, and the strain of the endless pretending, on top of the terror of the thing itself, drove him down into the blackest despair of his whole life. He consulted doctors, secretly, and the doctors of that age had nothing real to offer, no understanding of what was happening inside his ears, and no power at all to stop it, and they tried the useless remedies of the time, and they told him to rest his hearing, to go to the quiet of the countryside, and nothing helped, and nothing could, and slowly, out in the country in the summer of the year 1802, in a quiet village outside Vienna called Heiligenstadt, the whole weight of it came down on him at once, and he came as close to ending his own life as he would ever come. In that village, in the autumn of that year, alone, half-deaf, sunk as low as a human being can go, he sat down and wrote a letter that he never sent, and never meant to send, a letter addressed to his two brothers and meant to be found and read only after his death. It has come to be called the Heiligenstadt Testament, and it survived, folded away among his private papers, unknown to anyone until it was found after he died a quarter of a century later, and it is one of the most naked and heartbreaking documents ever written by any human being about their own suffering. In it he pours out the whole hidden truth at last. He tells his brothers, and through them the world, that people think him hostile and stubborn and misanthropic, a rude, unsociable man who avoids company and pushes everyone away, and that they cannot know the real reason, the secret reason he has hidden for 6 years, which is that the one sense which in him ought to have been more perfect than in other men, his hearing, the very sense on which his whole life and art depend, has been failing and failing until he can scarcely bear to be among people at all, because he cannot endure to have them shout so that he can hear, and cannot bear still less to let them discover the shameful truth. He writes of standing beside another man who could hear a flute playing in the distance, or a shepherd singing, while he himself could hear nothing at all, nothing, and of how such moments brought him to the very edge of despair, and how it would have taken very little for him to have put an end to his own life. And then, in the middle of that darkest of all his writings, something turns. He writes that the one thing, and only the one thing, that held him back from death was his art, his music. It seemed to him impossible, he says, to leave the world before he had brought forth all the music that he felt within him, all the works he was still carrying unwritten inside himself, and so for the sake of that unwritten music, and for that alone, he had endured and would go on enduring this wretched existence. And he resolved, there in that quiet village, half in despair and half in a strange rising defiance, to take fate by the throat, as he later put it, to seize his own terrible destiny in both hands and wrestle from it, in spite of everything, in spite of the closing silence, the music he had been born to make. And then he folded the letter away, and did not die, and went back to Vienna, and did exactly that. What follows is the most astonishing fact in the whole astonishing story, and it is worth saying very plainly and slowly, here in the quiet of the night. The deafness never stopped. It went on closing in year after year all the rest of his life, until he could hear almost nothing at all, and then nothing whatever. And it was during those very years, as the silence deepened around him toward total darkness, that Ludwig van Beethoven wrote nearly all of the music that made him immortal. Not before the deafness. During it. Because of it, some would even say. The comfortable, celebrated, golden young pianist of the 1790s, the man who could hear, wrote lovely, brilliant, promising music that would have earned him a respected minor place in history. It was the deaf man, the suffering man, the man who had looked into the pit and climbed back out of it with his fists clenched, who wrote the symphonies and the sonatas and the quartets that changed what music itself was and could be, and that still, 2 centuries on, reach into the chests of strangers who have never heard his name and take hold of something there and will not let go. He came back from Heiligenstadt a changed artist, and the change was immediate and enormous. And the music that now began to pour out of him was unlike anything the world had ever heard, bigger, longer, fiercer, deeper, more turbulent and more triumphant. Music that seemed to be about something, about struggle and endurance and the human will breaking through suffering into joy, the very story he was living turned into pure sound. He himself spoke around this time of setting out on a new path, and the new path led almost at once to the work that announced, like a cannon shot, that music had entered a new age, his 3rd symphony, the one he called the Eroica, the Heroic Symphony. It was enormous, nearly twice as long as any symphony anyone had written before, and it was violent and tender and grand and strange, opening with 2 great hammer blows and then a huge restless surging movement full of struggle, and a vast slow funeral march at its heart, a whole nation grieving in music, and it broke every rule of scale and proportion the polite 18th century had lived by. And audiences at first did not know what to make of it, and some walked out, and some said the man had gone mad or gone too far, and a few understood at once that the ground had shifted under their feet, and that music would never be the same. The story of that symphony carries in it too one of the most revealing episodes of his whole life, and it goes to the very heart of who he was. He had first meant to dedicate the Eroica to Napoleon Bonaparte. In those years, Napoleon was not yet the tyrant emperor of later legend, but the young general of the French Revolution, the astonishing common-born soldier who had risen by sheer ability from nothing to the leadership of a nation, who seemed to embody in one living man every burning idea Beethoven held most sacred: the overthrow of the old order of blood and privilege, the triumph of talent and merit, and the free human spirit, the promise of a new and juster world. Beethoven, the natural revolutionary, the peasant genius who would bow to no duke, worshipped what Napoleon seemed to stand for, and he wrote his colossal heroic symphony with that living hero in mind, and on the title page of his own manuscript he wrote the name Bonaparte, and then the news came. Napoleon, the champion of the Republic, the man of the people, had himself crowned emperor, had taken the old crown of kings and set it on his own head, had made himself exactly the kind of absolute lord he had risen up against, had betrayed, in Beethoven's furious eyes, the whole great cause in a single act of vanity. And when Beethoven heard it, he flew into one of the towering rages of his life, and he seized the manuscript of the symphony, and he took hold of the title page where the hero's name was written, and he tore at it so violently with his hands, scratching and gouging out the name, that he wore a hole clean through the paper. A hole that is still there in that manuscript today, a small ragged wound in a page, the physical mark of a great man's heartbreak and disgust. Now this fellow too, he raged, will trample on all the rights of men and think only of his own ambition, and he will set himself up above everyone and become a tyrant. He struck the name off, and he renamed the symphony simply the Eroica. The heroic symphony, composed, he wrote, to celebrate the memory of a great man, no longer any particular man, no longer the false hero Napoleon, but the idea of heroism itself, the greatness in the human spirit that Napoleon had briefly seemed to hold and had thrown away. The years that followed the Eroica, roughly the 10 years from the middle of the first decade of the new century onward, are the years scholars call his heroic or his middle period, and they are one of the great sustained outpourings of creation in the whole history of the human mind. A decade in which a slowly deafening man in a series of rented rooms in Vienna simply reached up and rewrote what music was. Out of those years came symphony after symphony, each one a whole world. There was the Fifth Symphony, which opens with the 4 most famous notes in all of music, 3 short and 1 long, that hammering little figure that everyone on earth seems to know, and knocking at the door that Beethoven is said, perhaps truly and perhaps not, to have called the sound of fate itself knocking, and out of that tiny fierce 4-note seed he grew a vast 40-minute journey. That travels from darkness and struggle in a stormy minor key all the way to a blazing, pounding, unstoppable triumph in the major. A whole drama of the human spirit fighting its way out of night into daylight, wordless and universal, understood in an instant by anyone anywhere who has ever suffered and hoped. And in the very same years, sometimes worked on side by side, with that stormy fifth, came its complete opposite and its perfect companion, the Sixth Symphony, the one he called the Pastoral, his great hymn to the countryside he loved above almost anything on earth. For this was the deepest private consolation of his whole afflicted life, and it takes us straight back to the man in the field with the notebook that we began with tonight. Beethoven loved nature, loved the woods and the fields and the streams outside Vienna, with a passion that was almost a religion to him. All his life, whenever he could, in every season he walked, for hours, alone, out into the country, striding along the paths and through the trees with his hat off and his notebook in his hand. And it was there, in the green quiet, that he was happiest and calmest and most himself. And it was there, above all, that the music came to him. And here is the thing to hold gently in the dark tonight, the quiet, unbearable heart of it. By the time he wrote the Pastoral Symphony, his great sunlit song of the countryside, with its babbling brook and its bird song and its peasants dancing and its sudden thunderstorm passing over and its calm and grateful hymn of thanksgiving after the storm, he could no longer really hear the countryside at all. He could not hear the brook he was painting in the music. He could not hear the birds, though he wrote their calls, the nightingale and the quail and the cuckoo, note for note into the score. The man who wrote the most beloved music of nature ever composed was walking through that nature in deepening silence, hearing it now only in memory and in imagination, inside the sealed chamber of his own head, and pouring back out onto paper, for the whole hearing world to enjoy forever, a green and living countryside that he himself could increasingly experience only as a kind of remembered dream. That is the paradox we began with, the man in the field who could not hear the brook and wrote the sound of it anyway, and it lies at the very centre of everything he was. And still the works came, more than one man's whole life should hold. There were the great piano concertos he wrote to play himself, until his own deafness finally drove him from the concert platform for good, including the fourth, which opens with the soloist alone, quiet and tender, a thing no one had dared before, and the fifth, so grand and majestic that others nicknamed it the Emperor, though he never called it that himself. There were the string quartets he wrote for the Russian ambassador, Count Razumovsky, music of such new depth and difficulty that the players who first tried it thought he must be joking, and told him so, and one of them asked whether he really considered this to be music, to which the composer, serenely certain across the centuries, in effect replied that it was not for them, but for a later age. There were the towering piano sonatas, the one called the Waldstein after his old friend from Bonn, the one called the Appassionata, full of storm and fire, works that pushed the piano and the pianist to the very edge of what was possible. And there was the one great opera of his life, the only one he ever finished, a work he wrestled with and rewrote and agonized over for years, and revised again and again because he cared so terribly about getting it right. It is a story about a brave and faithful wife who disguises herself as a young man and takes work as a jailer's assistant in a grim political prison in order to find and free her husband, an innocent man locked away in the dark by a wicked and powerful enemy, and it climbs at its climax out of the dungeon and into blazing daylight, and a great chorus of freed prisoners and liberated humanity, singing of freedom and justice and married love. Of course that was the story he poured his heart into. Freedom breaking into the darkness, a faithful love that will go into any prison and face any danger to rescue the beloved, the triumph of the innocent and the downfall of the tyrant. It was every ideal he had, dramatized, and he laboured over it as over nothing else. And its first version failed, badly, partly because it happened to open in a Vienna that had just been occupied by Napoleon's invading French army, with half the city's aristocracy fled and the theatre nearly empty, and he took it back, and cut it and reshaped it over years, until at last, in its final form, it became the beloved thing it remains. That failed first opera performance points at something running underneath all these triumphant creative years, which is that his outer life, his ordinary human life, was often a mess of frustration and disappointment and loneliness, even as the music soared. The wars were part of it. These were the years of Napoleon's wars, and the fighting rolled right across Beethoven's own doorstep more than once. Vienna was besieged and bombarded and occupied by the French twice, and on one of those occasions the cannon fire fell so heavily on the city that Beethoven, whose damaged ears could not bear loud sound, is said to have hidden in the cellar of his brother's house, with pillows pressed over his head to protect what little hearing he had left from the guns. which is about as cruel a picture as the age can offer. The greatest composer alive cowering in a basement under his own pillows, while the artillery of the man he had once worshipped and then despised pounded the city to pieces above him. Let us pause here, in the middle of the great creative flood, and look for a while at the man himself, the ordinary daily human being, because he is worth knowing, and because the picture is so very different from the noble marble bust that later ages made of him. To meet him in the street you would never have guessed. He was short and thick-set and powerfully built, with a broad pock-marked face, for he had survived the smallpox as a child, a heavy jaw, a wide mouth, dark skin that earned him the affectionate nickname the Spaniard among his friends, and above it all that famous wild thicket of dark hair later grey, that he never seemed to comb, standing straight up from his head as if permanently astonished. His eyes were small and dark and burning, and when the music took hold of him they blazed in a way people never forgot. He dressed carelessly, and as he grew older, worse than carelessly, in shabby coats gone shiny at the elbows, so that on at least one occasion, wandering absorbed and unkempt through the outskirts of a town, lost in music with his hands behind his back and peering in at windows, he was actually arrested as a tramp, a vagrant, a suspicious person, and hauled off to the watch-house, and it took some time and some indignant shouting before the local magistrate could be persuaded that this dishevelled muttering creature really was the most famous composer in Europe. He lived in a chaos that grew more spectacular every year. His rooms were a legendary disaster, littered with papers and half-eaten meals and unwashed dishes and full chamber pots and sheets of music covered in his furious crossings out, 2 or 3 or 4 pianos in various states of ruin, their strings broken and their frames cracked from the ferocity of his playing and from his habit, as his deafness grew, of hammering at them harder and harder to feel through his fingers and the wood of the floor the sound he could no longer hear. He moved constantly, restlessly, from lodging to lodging, dozens of times across his Vienna years, quarrelling with landlords, driven out by neighbours who could not bear the noise or the mess or the shouting, forever packing up his pianos and his papers and his one portrait of his grandfather and dragging the whole circus to some new set of rooms that he would wreck in turn. He was, to put it plainly, an extraordinarily difficult man to live near, or to work for, or to love. His temper was volcanic and instant. He suspected everyone of cheating him, his publishers, his servants, his friends, sometimes with reason and often without. He would fly into a rage, hurl abuse, throw whatever came to hand, break with a dear friend utterly and forever over some imagined slight, and then days or weeks or years later be overcome with remorse and write the most touching, humble, generous letter of apology, begging forgiveness, calling himself a wretch, and the friend, more often than not, would forgive him, because underneath the storms there was something in him, some enormous warmth and honesty and grandeur of soul, that made people willing to endure almost anything to stay near him. He had a rough, boisterous, sometimes coarse sense of humour, loved bad puns, loved teasing his friends mercilessly, could be uproariously funny and boyishly playful 1 hour and black as thunder the next. He was generous with money he did not have, and stingy and suspicious over money he did, both at once. He was, in short, gloriously, exhaustingly human, a great tangle of contradictions. And the friends who loved him, and there were always, despite everything, friends who loved him, loved the whole impossible tangle of him and would not have traded it. And he was lonely, deeply and permanently lonely, all his life, in the one respect that perhaps mattered to him most, for he longed, achingly, to love and to be loved, to marry, to have a home and a wife and a family of his own, the warm, ordinary happiness he had never had as a child. And it was the one thing, of all the things his will and his genius reached for, that he could never grasp. He fell in love again and again, usually with his own pupils, and usually with young women of the high aristocracy, beautiful cultivated countesses and baronesses who admired him enormously, were moved to tears by his playing, treasured his friendship, and could not possibly, given the iron rules of that world, marry a short, shabby deaf commoner of uncertain temper, however great his genius. The gulf of rank that he refused to bow to in the drawing-room was a gulf he could not cross into marriage, and one after another the women he loved married suitable men of their own class and slipped out of his reach, leaving him alone again with his music and his silence. Once, and only once, we catch him at the very edge of it, in the most famous and most mysterious love letter ever written, found, like the Heiligenstadt Testament, only after his death, folded away in the same secret drawer among his most precious private papers. It is a long, passionate, broken, ecstatic letter, written over a couple of days in July of some year he did not fully date, from a spa town where he had gone to take the waters, addressed to a woman he does not name, whom he calls only his immortal beloved, his angel, his all, his very self. In it he pours out a love that is plainly returned, a love of overwhelming depth, and wrestles page after aching page with the impossibility of their being together, with the cruelty of the circumstances that keep them apart, with his longing and his despair and his fierce resolve, and he signs it, ever thine, ever mine, ever ours. And then, so far as anyone can tell, he never sent it, or sent it and had it returned, or wrote it and thought better of it, and to this day no one knows for certain who she was, this immortal beloved, though scholars have argued about her identity for the better part of 2 centuries and filled whole libraries with their guesses. What we know is only this: somewhere in the middle of his life, this lonely, difficult deaf genius came to the very threshold of the great human happiness he wanted more than fame or glory, stood there with the letter in his hand, and then, for reasons we will never fully know, turned away from it and folded the letter into the drawer with the testament of his despair, and went back, as he always went back, to the one companion who never left him, never disappointed him, never married someone else, never failed to answer when he called, the music. After the immortal beloved, whoever she was, there is no more real hope of marriage in his story. Something in him seems to have closed. He went on longing for a family, but he stopped, more or less, believing he would ever have one of his own making, and it was precisely then, as if the thwarted longing had to pour itself somewhere, that his whole starved capacity for family love came crashing down, with the best and the very worst consequences, onto the head of a single small boy, his nephew. To understand the story of the nephew, we have to go back for a moment to the 2 younger brothers he had carried on his back since he was a boy in Bonn, Caspar Karl and Nikolaus Johann. Both of them had followed him, in time to Vienna, drawn along in the wake of his fame, and both of them tangled themselves through the rest of his life in ways that gave him far more grief than comfort. He loved them fiercely, with the anxious controlling love of a boy who had been made their guardian too young, and he never really stopped trying to manage them, to correct them, to run their lives for their own good as he saw it, and they, being grown men with wills of their own, resented it, and there were bitter quarrels. And one especially bitter one when the younger brother married a woman Beethoven despised, so bitterly that the composer, in a fit of fury, is said to have signed himself, in a bleak little joke, brain owner, over against his brother the mere landowner, the difference between what the 2 of them possessed. But it was the other brother, Caspar Karl, whose story turned into the great tragedy of Beethoven's later years. Caspar Karl fell ill, with the same wasting disease of the lungs that had taken their mother, and slowly, over years, it killed him. And in the autumn of the year 1815 he died, leaving behind a wife whom Beethoven loathed and distrusted with a bottomless passion, and a 9-year-old son named Karl. And here the great composer, the man of the towering will, made the decision that would poison the last decade of his life and reveal, more nakedly than anything else he ever did, both the depth of his need to love and the terrible damage that his own broken childhood had done to him. He decided that he, and he alone, must have the boy. He became convinced, with the unshakable, unarguable certainty he brought to everything, that the child's own mother was an immoral, unfit, dangerous woman from whom the boy must be rescued at any cost, and that it was his sacred duty as the great man of the family to take Karl away from her and raise him himself, to be the boy's true father, to make of him something fine, to pour into this one small nephew all the fatherhood he would never otherwise have. And so began one of the most painful and prolonged legal wars in the whole history of art. A custody battle that dragged on, off and on, for years, through court after court, appeal after appeal. The deaf and famous composer against the widowed mother, each side fighting for possession of a bewildered growing boy who loved, in his confused way, both of them, and was torn to pieces between them. Beethoven threw himself into this war with a ferocity and a lack of proportion that was frightening, and not always admirable. He spied on the mother and blackened her name, and used his fame and his powerful friends to press his case. And at one point the whole struggle turned on that small word we paused over so long ago, the little Flemish van in his name. Because one of the highest courts in Vienna handled only cases involving the true nobility, and the question arose whether a Van Beethoven was a nobleman at all, entitled to that court, and it came out, at last, painfully, in open proceedings, that the Van was not the noble von, that he had no title, no blood claim to nobility whatsoever, that he was, in the plain legal truth of it, a commoner like any other, and the case was moved down to the ordinary courts, and something in the proud man was wounded by that public unmasking that never quite healed. He won the boy, and lost him, and won him again, as the courts swung back and forth, and when at last he had him, the tragedy only deepened, because Beethoven had no more idea how to be a wise and gentle father than his own father had had, and he loved the boy in the only way he knew, which was overwhelmingly, suffocatingly, jealously, with endless demands and endless suspicion and endless lacerating emotion, smothering the boy with an intensity of need that no child could have borne, watching him, doubting him, forgiving him, accusing him, showering him with love and then with recrimination, until the boy, grown now into a young man, cracked under the unbearable weight of being the single vessel into which a genius poured a lifetime's dammed up and disappointed love. And in the summer of the year 1826, the young man Karl, in despair, went up into the hills outside Vienna and tried to take his own life with a pistol, and survived, wounded, and the scandal and the horror of it very nearly destroyed the old composer, who aged, people said, 10 years in the space of that one blow, his face suddenly that of a broken old man. It is not a comfortable part of the story, and it does no good to pretend otherwise. The same fierce, unstoppable will that let him take fate by the throat and wrestle immortal music out of total silence was, turned upon a living child, a kind of catastrophe, and the man who could pour boundless tenderness into a slow movement could not, in the flesh, give a frightened boy the simple, ordinary, steady kindness he needed. Genius and wisdom are not the same thing, and love felt is not the same as love well given, and Beethoven, who understood the human heart in music better than almost anyone who has ever lived, understood it, in his own kitchen, hardly at all. It is one of the saddest truths in his whole life, and it sits there, unresolved, beside all the glory, and we do him no honour by hiding it. And yet, and here is the thing that lifts even this darkest chapter, all through those same terrible years of the custody war and the lawyers and the spying and the boy's despair, the deaf old man in the wrecked and filthy rooms, half mad with worry and grief, went on, somehow, writing music, and the music he wrote in those very years, out of that very anguish, was not smaller or meaner or more broken for it. It was the greatest and the deepest and the most heaven-touching music of his entire life. To understand how that was even possible, we have to think, quietly and with wonder, about the plain physical question that everyone asks and few really pause over, which is how a man who could not hear could go on writing music at all, let alone the deepest music ever written. The answer lies in a truth about music that the deaf composer proved with his whole existence, which is that music does not, in the end, live in the ears. It lives in the mind. The ears are only the door. A trained musician, and above all a musician as complete and as saturated in the art as Beethoven had made himself through a lifetime, can look at written notes on a page and hear them, fully, richly, in every colour and combination, inside the silent theatre of the imagination, exactly as you, reading a remembered poem to yourself in the dark, can hear the rhythm and the music of the words without a sound being made in the room. He had spent his whole life filling his mind with sound, every symphony and quartet and song he had ever heard or written, the exact voice of every instrument, the way a horn blends with a clarinet, the weight of a cello under a violin, all of it stored and living inside him. And when the outer sound was taken away, the inner sound remained, undimmed, perhaps even, freed from the distractions of the real and imperfect world, grown purer and stranger and more limitless than ever. He composed, in these last years, in total or near total silence, hearing everything in his head, writing it down, working it over on paper, and sometimes to feel some ghost of it, biting down on a wooden stick or rod set against the body of the piano so that the vibrations of the struck strings would travel up the wood and through his jaw and into the bones of his skull, so that he could sense. Through his very bones, the music his ears could no longer bring him. Picture that, tonight as you drift, the old man bent over the piano with a stick clenched between his teeth pressed to the wood, listening with his skull to the thunder of chords he could not hear. And you will have one of the strangest and most moving images in the whole history of the human spirit. To speak with people at all in these final years, he used what came to be called his conversation books. He carried little blank notebooks and pencils with him everywhere, and when someone wished to say something to him, they would write it down in the book, and he would read it and answer aloud, in his own rough, loud, deaf man's voice, so that only one half of every conversation, the half written down by his visitors, survives. A strange one-sided record of questions and remarks and gossip and shopping lists and pleas and jokes, with his spoken answers gone forever into the air. Hundreds of these little books survived, and through them we can eavesdrop, across 2 centuries, on the daily texture of his silent world, the coffee ordered, the arguments with the housekeeper, the worries about the nephew, the talk of politics kept guarded, because the secret police of that fearful age were everywhere. He had chosen this silence, in a sense, long before, back in Heiligenstadt, when he chose to live for the unwritten music rather than die, and he had chosen Vienna too, and stayed there when he might have left. For once, years earlier, when he was still in his prime, a fine position had been offered him at a foreign court, a comfortable, honourable, well-paid post as music director to a king. Security for life, and he had let it be known that he was seriously tempted to take it, and the news that Vienna might actually lose its Beethoven so alarmed 3 of the greatest noblemen of the city, the Archduke Rudolph, who was the Emperor's own brother and Beethoven's devoted pupil and friend, together with Prince Kinsky and Prince Lobkowitz, that the 3 of them clubbed together and settled upon him, jointly, a guaranteed yearly income for the rest of his life, a generous annuity given on one condition only, that he remain in Vienna and go on composing. It was an astonishing thing, 3 great princes paying a commoner a salary simply to exist, and to write what he pleased, with no duties, no livery, no orders, and it marks, as clearly as anything in his whole life, the enormous change he himself had done so much to bring about, the birth of the modern idea of the artist as a free and sovereign being whom society supports not to serve it, but simply to create. The arrangement, being of that turbulent age, did not run smoothly, for the terrible inflation of the war years shrank the money's worth, and one of the princes died, and another fell into ruin, and there were lawsuits and shortfalls and worry, as there was always worry about money in Beethoven's life, no matter how much of it passed through his careless, suspicious hands. But the principle stood, and he stayed, and Vienna kept its Beethoven, and the world got the late music. And the late music is a country of its own. In the last decade or so of his life, as the outer silence became total and his health began its long decline, and the nephew tragedy tore at him, his music passed through a strange and wonderful and difficult change, moving away from the grand public heroics of the middle years into something far more inward, more private, more searching and mysterious and free. He seemed to be less and less interested in pleasing an audience, or dazzling anyone, or even in being understood, and more absorbed in some deep solitary conversation with the very roots of music and of the soul. The late piano sonatas wander into vast, slow meditations, and then break into fugues of dizzying complexity, and then dissolve into passages of the simplest, tenderest, most childlike song. His publishers and his public did not always know what to make of these late works, and often found them baffling, forbidding, the productions of a deaf recluse who had lost touch with what listeners wanted, and it would take the world the better part of a century fully to catch up with them and recognize them for the summits they are. But he was not writing for that public anymore. He was writing, you might say, for God, or for the future, or for the silence itself. And out of that silence, in these last years, he reached up and produced the two colossal works that crown his whole life, and that he himself regarded as his greatest, a vast sacred mass, and the last and mightiest of his symphonies, the ninth. The great mass came first, and it grew out of love and occasion both, for his dearest and most faithful patron, the Archduke Rudolph, the Emperor's brother who had studied piano and composition with him for years and remained loyal to him through everything, was to be made an archbishop, installed with great ceremony, and Beethoven set out to write a mass to be sung at the installation. A gift worthy of the friendship. But once he began, the thing seized him, and grew far beyond any single occasion, as his greatest works always did, and he laboured over it for years, missing the installation date by a long way, pouring into it everything he knew and believed and had suffered, until it had become not a piece of church furniture at all, but one of the mightiest and most personal statements of faith and doubt and longing ever set to music, a vast, difficult, overwhelming setting of the ancient words of the Mass, in which the old deaf man wrestles with the very question of whether heaven is listening, whether there is peace to be had, whether the prayer for mercy and the prayer for peace can ever truly be answered in a world so full of war and suffering. He wrote at the head of it that it came from the heart, and might it go to the heart, and it did, though again the world was slow to receive so strange and towering a thing. And alongside the Mass, and finished a little after it, came the work that more than any other has carried his name to the ends of the earth, the ninth and last symphony, the one that ends, unprecedentedly, impossibly, with a great chorus of human voices singing. He had carried the seed of it for most of his life. Back in his Bonn youth, more than 30 years before, he had read and fallen in love with a poem by the German poet Schiller, a great ringing ode in praise of the joy that binds all human beings together into one family, all men becoming brothers, a whole world embracing, under a loving God above the canopy of stars. That vision of universal human brotherhood, all people joined in joy across every barrier of rank and nation, was the very dream Beethoven had believed in with his whole soul since he was young, the dream behind his fury at kings and his worship of freedom and his refusal to bow. And for more than 3 decades he had wanted, someday, somehow, to set that ode to music, and now at the end, deaf and aging and near the close of everything, he found the way. He built an enormous symphony, 4 movements of struggle and wild energy and heartbreaking slow beauty. And then, in the finale, he did the thing no one had ever done. He brought in a full chorus and 4 solo singers, human voices, right into the middle of a symphony, and set them to sing Schiller's great hymn to joy, so that the whole vast work climbs and climbs through darkness and searching until it breaks out at last into that simple, mighty, unforgettable tune, the melody the whole world now knows as the Ode to Joy, sung by hundreds of voices in a blaze of affirmation, all people becoming brothers, joy the daughter of heaven, the millions embracing, a kiss for the whole world. It is quite simply one of the supreme moments in all of human art. A deaf man's roar of defiant, hard-won, universal joy flung out into a suffering world. And it has become, in our own time, something close to the anthem of all humanity, played at the fall of walls and the ending of wars and the joining of nations, exactly as its maker, in his deepest heart, would have wished. And the story of its first performance is the moment of all the moments in his life to carry with you down into sleep tonight, because it gathers the whole of him into a single unbearable image. It was the spring of the year 1824, in a theatre in Vienna, and the city, which had lately grown a little cool toward its difficult old genius, and rather taken up with lighter, prettier, more fashionable music from Italy, turned out all the same curious, expectant, to hear the first performance of the new symphony by the great Beethoven, who had not shown the public a major new symphony in years and years. He was there on the stage, though by now, of course, he could conduct nothing, could not hear a note of his own orchestra, and so another musician stood before the players to lead them, and Beethoven stood near him, score in hand, beating the time and marking the tempos as best he could, turning the pages of the music that thundered on, entirely unheard, inside the silence of his own head. And the players had been quietly told, beforehand, by the real conductor, to watch him with respect, but to follow the true beat, and not to be led astray by the deaf man's gestures, for he could not keep with them, hearing nothing. And so the great symphony was played, all of it, the struggle and the slow movement and the wild scherzo, and at last the enormous choral finale with its hundreds of voices pouring out the ode to joy, filling the theatre with a wall of triumphant sound, and the audience, overwhelmed, rose and roared and wept and applauded as they had rarely applauded anything in their lives, waving their hands and their handkerchiefs, an ovation like a storm breaking over the hall. And Beethoven, at the front of the stage, still bent over his score, still lost in the silent music inside him, beating a time that had already finished, heard none of it. Not one clap, not one cheer. He did not know the piece had ended in a tumult of glory, did not know the whole theatre was on its feet behind him roaring his name, because for him there was only the silence there had been for years, the same unbroken silence, and he went on turning his pages in it, facing the orchestra, his back to the thundering hall. And then one of the singers, a young woman, seeing that he had no idea, stepped forward and gently took the old man by the sleeve, and turned him around, turned him bodily to face the audience, so that he might see with his eyes what he could not hear with his ears. And he saw it. He saw the whole hall risen and roaring, hundreds of faces streaming and shining, hundreds of hands thrown up and waving, the handkerchiefs, the mouths open in cheers he would never hear. A great silent storm of love and awe breaking over him for the music he had dragged up out of his own deafness and given to them all. He saw it, and he understood it, and the people, seeing him turn, and seeing him at last understand, only cheered the harder, wept the harder, at the sight of the deaf master beholding in silence the joy he had made and could not hear. There has never been a scene like it, before or since, in the whole history of art, and there never will be again, and everything he was, all of it, the crying child on the footstool, the boy who lost his mother, the young man who would not be a servant, the terror at Heiligenstadt, the letter to the immortal beloved, the stick clenched between his teeth, the will that took fate by the throat, all of it is gathered into that one moment of a stranger's hand on his sleeve, turning him around to see the love he could not hear. After the Ninth Symphony there was still a little more, and it was the strangest and most inward music of all, the last 5 string quartets, written in the final years of his life, for no occasion and almost no reward, simply because the music was in him and had to come out. A string quartet is the most private and intimate form in all of music, only 4 instruments, 2 violins, a viola and a cello, 4 voices talking together in a room, with nowhere to hide and no orchestra to lean on, and it was to this most naked of forms that the old deaf master turned at the very end, and into it he poured the deepest and most personal music he ever wrote. Music that seems to come from some region beyond ordinary human experience altogether, ranging in a single work from wild dancing energy to passages of almost unbearable stillness and tenderness. Long, slow movements that feel like prayers or like the soul looking back over a whole life, and sudden bursts of rough humour, and moments of such strange, far-off beauty that listeners often feel they are overhearing something not quite meant for human ears. Over one of the slow movements, a vast hymn of thanksgiving written after he had recovered from a serious illness, he wrote that it was a holy song of thanks from one made well again, offered to the divine, and you can hear in it a man at the very edge of life giving thanks simply for one more season of breath. These quartets, like the other late works, baffled almost everyone at the time, and were dismissed by many as the ramblings of a deaf old man who had lost his way, and it took generations for the world to understand that they are among the greatest things ever created in any art by anyone, and that in them Beethoven had gone somewhere no composer had ever gone before, out past the edge of the known and into a music of pure spirit. They were the last things he finished. His body, worn out by a lifetime of illness and hardship and neglect, was failing now in earnest. He had never been truly well since childhood, had suffered all his life from fierce and painful complaints of the stomach and the bowels that tormented him for decades, and now, on top of everything, his liver was giving out, swollen and hardened and diseased, most likely from the long slow damage of the years, and his body began to fill with fluid. A cruel dropsical swelling that no doctor of the age could cure. The final blow came from an ordinary journey. In the autumn of the year 1826, after the horror of his nephew's attempt on his own life, the old man took the wounded boy away for a while to stay at the country estate of his surviving brother, the landowner, to recover, and there, in the country he had always loved, he worked on and quarrelled and grew no happier, and when at last he set out to return to Vienna as the year turned cold, the journey home was a wretched one, in an open carriage or a poor cold conveyance of some kind, through raw December weather, and he arrived back in the city chilled to the bone and gravely ill, with an inflammation of the lungs on top of everything else, and he took to his bed, and he never really rose from it again. For 3 months through the winter and into the spring of the year 1827, he lay dying in his rooms in Vienna, his body swollen and racked, and the doctors came and tapped the fluid from him, again and again, a brutal procedure endured without the mercy of any real relief, and he suffered greatly and bore it, on the whole, with a rough patience and even flashes of his old grim humour, joking bleakly about the doctors and the operations even as they drained him. The world, which had drifted from him a little in his last difficult years, remembered him now that he was dying. And kindnesses came. Old friends gathered. Admirers sent gifts and messages. From distant England, from the musicians of London who revered him, came a sum of money to ease his last days, and it touched him deeply. Word was sent for and arrived of things that pleased him, and he was able, near the end, to receive the last rites of the church with what those present felt was real peace. And then, on the 26th day of March, in the year 1827, in the late afternoon, as he lay unconscious and sinking in his bed, a great storm came up over Vienna, a wild spring thunderstorm with snow and lightning and enormous crashing peals of thunder rolling over the city. The loudest sound in nature, the one sound, perhaps, that even his ruined ears might once have felt in the bones. And those who were in the room told afterward, and the story has been passed down ever since, that at the height of the storm, at a tremendous clap of thunder, the dying man, who had lain still and senseless for hours, suddenly opened his eyes, and raised his right arm up from the bed, and clenched his fist, and held it there a moment, raised against the sky, or against the thunder, or against death, or against fate itself, the same fate he had seized by the throat a quarter of a century before. And then the arm fell back, and he was gone. We cannot know exactly what that raised fist meant, or whether it happened just as the story tells it, softened and shaped as such stories always are by the grief and the awe of those who carry them. But it is how they remembered it, the ones who were there, and it is how the world has chosen to remember it ever since, and there is a rightness in it too deep to argue with. The man of the unconquerable will going out of the world, not quietly and not gently, but with his fist raised in the thunder, defiant to the very last heartbeat. He was 56 years old. The city that had cooled toward him in his difficult last years understood, the moment he was dead, exactly what it had lost. The news went out through Vienna and through the whole musical world beyond it, and something like a great collective grief took hold. The sense that a giant had passed, that an age had ended, that the earth had grown suddenly smaller. His funeral, 3 days after his death, was one of the largest that city had ever seen for anyone who was neither a king nor a soldier, an outpouring of public sorrow astonishing for a mere composer, a shabby deaf commoner who had quarrelled with half the people he ever knew. The schools were closed. The crowds came, and came, and came, until the estimates ran to 10,000, 20,000, some said 30,000 people, filling the street outside the house and the square and every window and rooftop. So many that soldiers had to be called to clear a path for the coffin. And the short journey from the house to the church, which should have taken minutes, took hours. The great procession creeping through the packed and weeping city. The finest musicians of Vienna carried torches and held the ribbons of the pall. Among the torchbearers walking in the cortege, one small quiet figure is almost unbearable to think of. A young composer, poor and unknown and himself only a year from his own early grave, who worshipped Beethoven this side of idolatry and had scarcely dared to approach him in life. A shy young man named Franz Schubert, who would be buried, at his own dying wish, close to the master he revered, and who walked now among the mourners carrying his torch for the man he loved. Great words were spoken over the grave, a famous oration written by one of the leading poets of the day, and read aloud to the vast silent crowd, calling him the last master of the great line, the heir of the immortals, and speaking of how he had shut himself off from the world because he found no other soul to match his own, and had lived alone because he found no second self, but had remained, to the end, a human being, a whole and suffering and loving human being, and that they should not mourn him as lost, but honour him as passed into the company of the ever-living. And then they lowered him into the ground, and the enormous crowd went slowly home through the spring evening, and the greatest composer who had ever lived was, at last, silent in the way that comes to all of us. It was only afterward, in the quiet days that followed, when his friends and executors went into the wrecked and cluttered rooms to sort through the chaos of a lifetime, the mountains of papers, the broken pianos, the pawn tickets and unpaid bills and unanswered letters and the sketches for music never finished, that they came upon the 2 secret documents we have already spoken of, folded away together in a hidden drawer of an old cabinet, kept close and private through all the years of moves and quarrels and grief. There was the Heiligenstadt Testament, the despairing letter to his brothers from the dark autumn a quarter of a century before, in which the young man on the edge of self-destruction had chosen the unwritten music over death. And there was the letter to the immortal beloved, the unsent outpouring of the one great returned love of his life, addressed to the woman he never named and never won. He had carried them both, these 2 most naked confessions of his whole soul, the depth of his despair and the depth of his love, secretly, everywhere, all his life, from lodging to lodging across the years, next to his heart, telling no one, and only death unlocked the drawer and let the world see, at last, what the gruff, difficult, unknowable man had been carrying hidden inside him all along. And with them, in the same rooms, was of course the music, the vast, finished, glorious body of it, and it was this, in the end, that death could not touch, and time could not silence, and that has only grown and grown in the 2 centuries since. for here is the strange and beautiful arithmetic of a life like his. The man suffered almost without pause. He lost his mother young, and his hearing in his prime. He never married the family he longed for. He tormented and was tormented by the boy he tried to save. He lived in mess and illness and loneliness and quarrels, and he died swollen and racked at 56, with his fist raised against the storm. If you weighed only the pain of it, day by day, it would seem one of the harder bargains a human being was ever handed. And yet out of that one difficult suffering life came a river of joy and consolation and courage that has flowed, without stopping, into the lives of hundreds of millions of people he never met and could never have imagined, in countries that did not exist when he lived, through machines he could never have dreamed of, and flows still, tonight, this very night, in 1,000 rooms across the world where his music is playing, in concert halls and kitchens and cars and hospitals and headphones in the dark, bringing to strangers everywhere exactly the courage and the comfort and the sense of a great heart beating alongside their own that he wrung, note by note, out of his own silence. It is worth lingering, in the soft hours of the night, on just how completely this one life changed the thing it touched. Because it is hard, from where we stand now, 200 years downstream, to feel how enormous the change really was. When Beethoven was born, a composer was a craftsman and a servant, a skilled tradesman who supplied music the way a tailor supplied coats, to order, to please a patron, to fill a need, and the music was expected to be pleasant, well-made, agreeable, and then, when the occasion was past, largely forgotten, replaced by the next fresh thing, for there was very little sense that a piece of music was a permanent monument meant to outlast its maker and be treasured forever. Composers wrote fast, and wrote a great deal, and expected most of it to vanish, and it did. By the time Beethoven died, all of that had begun to turn inside out, and he, more than any other single human being, had turned it. He had made of the composer not a servant, but a prophet, a free and sovereign artist answerable to nothing but his own vision and his own conscience. A man who did not supply music to please the powerful, but summoned it up out of his own depths and offered it to all humanity and to the future, and who expected and got to be honoured as a kind of secular saint for doing so. He had made of a symphony not a pleasant hour's diversion, but a vast spiritual journey, a wrestling with fate and death and joy on the largest possible scale, a thing you did not merely enjoy but were changed by. He had made music itself larger, longer, deeper, louder, stranger, more personal, more ambitious, had stretched every form he touched almost to breaking and then broken it, and built something greater from the pieces, had put into instrumental music, music with no words at all, a weight of meaning and feeling and thought that no one had believed mere sound could carry. And every single composer who came after him, for the whole of the century that followed and beyond, had to live in the enormous shadow he cast, had to reckon with him, measure themselves against him, struggle out from under him. For he had raised the whole idea of what music could be, and mean to a height that both inspired and terrified everyone who followed. Some of the very greatest composers of the generations after him confessed that they hardly dared to write a symphony at all. So crushing was the weight of his example. So impossible did it seem to say anything after he had said so much. And one of them laboured for more than 20 years, in awe and dread, before he felt able to send his own first symphony out into a world that still heard, behind every symphony, the giant footsteps of Beethoven. He had, in a sense, invented the very idea of the towering, world-shaking, immortal artist, the lonely genius who suffers and sacrifices everything and gives humanity a gift for the ages. The idea we now take so for granted that we forget it had to be invented at all, and he had invented it not with a manifesto, but simply by being it, by living it out in full view, the shabby deaf commoner who bowed to no one and wrote for eternity. And his fame, which had wavered a little in his difficult last years, did not fade after his death as the fame of the fashionable so quickly fades. It grew. It grew steadily, decade by decade, generation by generation, spreading out from Vienna across all of Europe and then across the seas to the whole world, until his name became and remains perhaps the single most universally recognized name in the entire history of music, known in every country on earth, spoken by people who could not name another composer if their lives depended on it. His symphonies became the very pillars of the concert repertoire, played and replayed everywhere year after year, the fifth and the sixth and the seventh and the mighty ninth, the works that orchestras measure themselves by and audiences never tire of. His piano sonatas became the mountains that every serious pianist must someday climb, and the Ode to Joy from his Ninth Symphony travelled so far beyond the concert hall that it became, in our own age, the official anthem of a united Europe, sung and played at moments of reconciliation and triumph and hope all over the globe, the deaf man's hymn to human brotherhood become, quite literally, a song for all humanity. Even those 4 hammering notes from the opening of his Fifth Symphony, that little fierce figure of fate knocking at the door, took on a life beyond all music, becoming during a terrible war of the 20th century a secret signal of resistance and coming victory, tapped out and broadcast across occupied lands as a message of defiant hope, so that the struggle he had written into that music, the fight of the human spirit up out of darkness toward the light, became a real and living comfort to real people in real danger more than 100 years after he set the notes down in a rented room in Vienna. That is a kind of immortality granted to very, very few. Most of us pass, and are mourned by those who loved us, and then, in a generation or 2 or 3, are gently forgotten, our names worn smooth and blank on a stone, and there is no shame and no sorrow in that. It is simply the common lot, the tide coming in over all our footprints. But a very small handful of human beings do something, once that the tide cannot reach, that goes on giving and giving after they are gone, long after everyone who knew them is also gone, and Ludwig van Beethoven, the crying child on the footstool, the boy who lost his mother, the man who lost his hearing, is as surely one of those few as anyone who has ever lived. Let us go back over it all now, slowly, gently, one last time, the way you might walk back through the rooms of a house at the end of a long day, turning down the lamps one by one, not to study anything closely any more, but only to say a quiet goodnight to each room in turn. It began beside a wide grey river, in a small provincial town of red roofs and vineyards and a pink palace, in a narrow house on a narrow street, where a famous respected grandfather had once been the master of all the court's music, and where a weaker son, a drinking tenor, had come down in the world, and where, one cold week in December, a dark-eyed child was born and given a dead brother's name and the great-grandfather's name, both at once. It began with a small boy standing on a footstool to reach the keys of a clavier, playing through his tears while a drunken father loomed over him and neighbours listened at the walls. A boy robbed of his sleep in the dark to perform for his father's tavern friends. A boy who by every reasonable expectation should have grown up to hate the very sound of music, and who instead, underneath all the fear, fell so deeply and so permanently in love with it that nothing the rest of the world could do to him ever shook that love loose. It moved on through a first great teacher who taught him out of kindness and printed his name in a journal and told the world a second Mozart was coming. Through the loss of the gentle worn-out mother when the boy was only 16, his best friend, he called her, gone in a single summer, and the sinking of the father and the boy of 18 made the keeper of his own father's wages and the true father of his 2 younger brothers, learning far too young that if anything at all were to be held together, he alone would have to hold it. Through the warm, cultivated house of the widow and her children, where he first learned to read and to think and to dream, the great burning dreams of freedom and human brotherhood that would fill his music to the end. And then the road south, in the last cold days of a year long ago, the coach pulling away from the little town he would never see again, the friend's farewell note about receiving the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn, and the arrival, young and fierce and unknown, in the glittering, enormous imperial city that would hold the whole rest of his life. It moved through the dazzling rise, the improviser who made hardened aristocrats weep, the greatest pianist in Vienna, the man who would not be a servant, who moved among princes as their equal or their better, and made them like it, who dressed like a tramp and quarrelled with everyone, and was forgiven everything, because the gift was so overwhelming. And then, at the very height of that first golden rising, the tide beginning to go out, the ringing and buzzing that would not stop, the words blurring across a room, the slow unbearable understanding that the one sense he could not lose was the sense he was losing, and the years of hiding it in terror, and the black autumn in the quiet village where he sat down to write his farewell to the world. And instead, in the middle of the writing, chose the unwritten music over death, and folded the letter away, and went back, and took fate by the throat. It moved through the great heroic decade that followed, the symphonies that rewrote what music was, the hero's name torn so hard from the title page that it wore a hole in the paper, the 4 notes of fate knocking at the door. The sunlit countryside he painted in sound while he could no longer hear the brook or the birds, the one opera about freedom breaking into the darkness that he loved too much to leave alone. Through the long loneliness underneath it all, the loves that could never cross the gulf of rank, the one great returned love poured out in a letter to a woman he never named and folded away unsent beside the letter of his despair, the family he longed for and never had. Through the nephew, the smothering, desperate love that was the best and the worst of him, the custody war, the boy driven to despair, the old man aged 10 years in a night, and the music somehow only deepening through all of it. Through the total silence at last, the conversation books, the stick clenched between his teeth to feel the music through his skull, the strange far country of the late, works that the world would take 100 years to understand, through the mighty mass that came from the heart and might go to the heart, and the last symphony with its hundreds of voices roaring out the ode to joy, and the young singer's hand on his sleeve turning him around to see the storm of love he could not hear. Through the last quartets, the most inward music ever made, a soul looking back over a whole life, and then the failing body, the swelling, the doctors and their tappings, the wretched cold journey home, the 3 months dying, the kindnesses arriving from far away, and at the end the spring thunderstorm over Vienna, and the raised fist, and the arm falling back, and the silence that comes to us all, and then the closed schools and the vast weeping crowd, and the torches, and the shy young worshipper carrying his light in the procession, and the 2 secret letters found folded in the drawer, and the music, the great river of music, flowing out from that one difficult suffering life into all the centuries and all the countries and all the quiet dark rooms that were still to come. Flowing even into this one, tonight, wherever you are lying as you listen. There is one thought more to turn over gently before we let the story go for the night, and it is perhaps the deepest thing his whole life has to give us, lying here in the dark. We are used to believing, most of us, in a quiet unspoken way, that the good things in a life come from the good circumstances of it, that happiness is built out of health and ease and love returned and fortune's favour, and that suffering is simply subtraction, a taking away, a darkness that leaves less of a person than there was before. And often enough that is true, and suffering is only suffering, and does only harm, and we should never romance it or pretend that pain is a gift, for a great deal of pain is no gift at all, and only breaks what it touches. And yet here is this one life that will not quite fit inside that plain sad arithmetic. Here is a man from whom the world took, one by one, nearly all the things we think a good life is made of. It took his mother early. It took the ordinary safety of childhood and gave him fear instead. It took the health of his body, which tormented him with pain for decades. It took, most cruelly and most impossibly of all, the one sense on which his whole self and his whole art depended, drawing it away from him slowly and completely in the very prime of his powers. It took the wife and the children and the warm, settled home he longed for more than anything. It gave him loneliness and quarrels and a heartbreak with the one boy he tried to love, and a swollen, racked death at 56. And out of all that taking, out of the silence above all, out of the very centre of the loss, came not less, but more, came a river of joy and grandeur and tenderness and courage so vast that it has been pouring into other people's lives for 200 years and shows no sign of ever running dry. That is the mystery at the heart of him, and it is worth holding, not because it makes the suffering worth it, for we cannot say that and should not try, but because it tells us something true and strange and hopeful about what a human being is, which is that we are not simply the sum of what happens to us, that there is in us some deep, stubborn, creative fire that can sometimes, in some people, take even the worst that life can do and turn it, by sheer unbreakable will and love, into something that outlasts the harm 1,000-fold. He said once, in a letter written in the depths of his troubles, that he would seize fate by the throat, that it should never wholly crush him, and he did, and it did not, and the proof of it is playing somewhere in the world at this very moment, and will be playing somewhere in the world at every moment for as far ahead as any of us can see. And there is a particular gift in his music, over and above its beauty, that is worth naming as you drift, because it is the reason so many people who are suffering, or frightened, or lonely, or grieving, reach for Beethoven above almost anyone else. It is that his music never pretends the darkness is not real. It does not offer a thin, cheap comfort that looks away from the pain. It goes down into the darkness, all the way down into the storm and the struggle and the grief, and lets it be as terrible as it truly is, and only then, having been honest about the worst, does it begin the long hard climb back up toward the light, so that when the triumph comes, when the Fifth Symphony breaks at last out of its stormy night into that pounding blaze of major key victory, or when the Ninth opens up into the great embrace of the Ode to Joy, you believe it all the way down, because it has not been handed to you cheaply. It has been earned, fought for, dragged up out of a real darkness by a man who knew more about darkness than almost anyone, and so his joy has a weight and a truth that easy joy can never have. That is why a person sitting alone in a hospital, or lying awake at 3 a.m. with a heart full of fear, or standing at a graveside, so often finds in this deaf-dead man a companion that the cheerful and the comfortable cannot be, because he has been there, all the way down, and he came back up singing, and his music takes you by the hand and says, without a single word, that the darkness is real, and the climb is real, and the light at the top is real too, and that a human spirit can make that whole journey and come through. He did not know you. He could not have imagined you, in your particular room, in your particular hour of the night, in a world he would not recognize. And yet he made, out of his own long trouble, exactly the companionship you might need, and left it lying about the world like light, free for anyone to pick up. Forever, there are not many gifts like that. There have not been many lives like that. And the wonderful strange thing is that he is not really finished, even now, even 200 years gone into the ground beside the river of a city far away. Because a gift like his does not stay in the past where the giver died. It keeps arriving. It arrives new every time a young person hears the Ninth Symphony for the first time and feels the hair rise on their arms. Every time a tired parent puts on the slow movement of a sonata to quiet a crying child. Every time an orchestra somewhere tunes its strings and prepares, once more, to carry those 4 hammering notes of fate up out of the darkness and into the light for a hall full of living, breathing people who need, tonight, exactly what he has to give. The crying boy on the footstool is still giving it. The deaf man with the stick between his teeth is still giving it. He seized fate by the throat, and he would not be wholly crushed, and because he would not, none of us who come after, in our own smaller darknesses, need feel entirely alone in them, and that, perhaps, in the end, is the whole meaning of the strange and difficult and glorious life we have followed tonight, all the way from the narrow house by the grey river to the raised fist in the spring. Thunder. Before we finally close the book on him for the night, let us sit for a little while with the ordinary daily craft of the man, the plain human business of how all that music actually got made, because it is one of the most reassuring things in his whole story, and a good thing to carry down into sleep. We tend to imagine genius as a kind of effortless lightning, the finished masterpiece arriving whole and perfect in a flash of divine inspiration, the composer merely taking dictation from the heavens. Mozart, rightly or wrongly, has come down to us wrapped in that legend, the music pouring out of him complete. Beethoven was the opposite, and knew it, and it is the great encouragement he offers to every ordinary struggling person who has ever tried to make anything at all. His music did not arrive whole. It was fought for inch by inch over months and years, wrestled and hammered and rebuilt out of the roughest and most unpromising beginnings. We know this beyond any doubt, because he left behind mountains of sketchbooks, hundreds of them, in which he worked his ideas out, and we can watch him, page after page, catching some fragment of a tune, a few notes, and then turning it over and over, trying it this way and that way, crossing it out, changing one note, changing it back, wrestling a phrase through 20 or 30 or 40 clumsy versions before it became the thing we now think could never have been any other way. Some of the most sublime and inevitable seeming melodies in all of music, tunes that feel as though they must have existed since the beginning of the world, began in those sketchbooks as awkward, stiff, almost ugly little scraps that a lesser man might have thrown away in embarrassment, and he simply refused to let them go, and worked them with an inhuman patience and stubbornness, until the awkward scrap had been beaten and coaxed into a thing of perfect grace. The genius, in other words, was not that the music came easily. It was that he would not stop until it was right, that he had a vision in his inner ear of what a passage ought to be, and an absolute refusal to accept anything less, and the will to sit with a stubborn phrase for as long as it took, weeks if need be, until it yielded. There is more hope in that, for the rest of us, than in any amount of effortless miracle, because it means the greatest things are built not only out of gift, but out of persistence, out of showing up again and again to the same difficult problem and refusing to be beaten by it. And the shape of his days was as plain and as human as the sketchbooks. He rose early, and he worked at his composing through the morning, the best hours, at the desk or the piano amid the glorious mess. He was fanatical about his coffee, and made it himself, and insisted, so the story goes, on exactly 60 beans to the cup, counting them out one by one, which is either the mark of a fussy obsessive, or simply of a man who knew what he liked and meant to have it, and is anyway a rather comforting picture, the great tormented genius bent over his kitchen table gravely counting coffee beans. He ate simply and often carelessly, and every single day, in almost every weather, after the midday meal, he went out and he walked, long and hard and fast, out of the city and into the woods and fields and hills he loved, for hours, alone, his hat off, his hands behind his back, the little sketchbook and the stub of pencil in his pocket, and it was there, moving through the green world, that the music most often came to him, so that the walking and the composing were in the end nearly the same activity, the ideas rising up out of the rhythm of his own striding feet and the wind in the trees he could no longer hear. He would stop and scribble and walk on and stop and scribble again, and come home at dusk with his pockets full of fragments and set to work turning the fragments into worlds. It was in that spirit of walking and dancing energy that he wrote the 7th of his symphonies, a work so full of driving, pounding, irresistible rhythm from end to end that one of the greatest composers who came after him called it the very apotheosis of the dance raised up to heaven, and its slow movement, a solemn, tramping, unforgettable procession that begins almost in a whisper and builds, became one of the most beloved things he ever wrote. Music that has been reached for ever since at moments of great public grief and great public feeling, because it seems to hold in it the tread of all humanity walking together through sorrow. He wrote an 8th symphony too, smaller and sunnier and full of jokes and high spirits, for he was not always the storming Titan, and had a great fund of rough good humour that comes out in the music more often than the marble legend suggests. Sudden bursts of laughter and mischief and playful surprise tucked in among the thunder. And in his last years he poured a similar stubborn genius into a great set of variations for the piano, dozens of them, built on a silly, trivial little waltz tune that a publisher had sent round to every composer in Vienna, asking each to write one variation for a collection. A small commercial nothing, and Beethoven, half in scorn and half in fascination, took that trifling little tune and wrote not one variation but a whole vast towering series of them, wringing out of the cheap little waltz every possible feeling and form and transformation, from the comic to the sublime, as if to prove that a true master could take even the most worthless scrap of material and build a cathedral from it. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what he had done with his whole broken, difficult life. Everything he touched, the ugly sketch, the silly waltz, the drunken childhood, the closing silence, the whole raw, unpromising material fate handed him, he took and worked and would not let go, and turned, by sheer refusal to be beaten, into something golden and lasting and full of grace. We have followed the inward story so closely, the deafness and the music and the lonely heart, that it is worth stepping back out, for a while, into the wide public world he moved through, because there was one strange, dazzling moment, in the middle of his life, when Ludwig van Beethoven was not merely admired by connoisseurs, but was, for a season, the most celebrated and fashionable composer in all of Europe, feted by emperors and kings, the toast of a continent, and the story of that moment, and of how oddly it came about, tells us a great deal about fame and about him. It happened in the years when the long wars against Napoleon were at last grinding toward their end. For more than 20 years the shadow of the French emperor had lain across the whole continent, army after army, campaign after campaign, the map of Europe torn up and redrawn again and again, and Beethoven's own city occupied and bombarded twice. And then, at last, the tide turned, and the great powers gathered their strength, and Napoleon's armies began to be beaten. And a wave of patriotic joy and relief swept across the German lands, and beyond as the tyrant, as they now all called him, was driven back toward his fall. And Beethoven, who had once worshipped Napoleon and then torn his name through the paper in disgust, was caught up in that patriotic wave like everyone else, and he wrote, in that swept-along mood, a piece quite unlike his great serious works, a noisy, vivid, crowd-pleasing musical picture of one of the battles in which Napoleon's forces were beaten, full of the sounds of the two opposing armies, their marching tunes, the roar and rattle of cannon and musket fire painted in the orchestra, building to the rout of the French and a great blaze of victory music, and the triumphant national anthems of the winning side. It was, if we are honest, not remotely among his finest creations, a piece of grand, patriotic noise, a battle picture built partly for a mechanical music machine and then expanded for full orchestra, and he knew perfectly well it was a lesser thing, and once said as much with a shrug. But it was exactly what the moment wanted, and it was an absolute sensation, a runaway popular hit on a scale none of his profound masterpieces had ever quite matched in his own lifetime, performed to roaring, cheering, packed houses, making him more money and more noise and more fashionable fame than the Eroica and the Fifth Symphony put together. There is a lesson in that, and a rather rueful one, about how the deepest work is so often not the work the crowd runs to, and how the same artist can be adored in his own day for his slightest thing, while his greatest things wait patiently for a later age to catch up, and Beethoven, who was nobody's fool, understood the irony of it perfectly well, even as he cheerfully cashed the takings. And the great public triumph came to its peak when the war was won and the crowned heads and statesmen of all Europe gathered in Vienna itself, in that glittering autumn and winter, for the enormous congress that was to remake the map of the continent and settle the peace after a generation of war. For months Vienna was the centre of the world, stuffed with emperors and kings and princes and ambassadors and their glittering trains, an endless whirl of balls and banquets and spectacles and diplomacy, and the city put on its greatest musician for its greatest guests, and Beethoven, for that one shining season, stood at the very summit of public glory. His battle piece was played to the assembled royalty. A grand new cantata of his was performed in their honour. He gave a great concert before an audience thick with the sovereigns of Europe, and was cheered and honoured and presented and celebrated as never before or after, the musician of the victorious Allied cause, the glory of Vienna, the most famous composer alive at the very moment his city was the most famous place on earth. It was the high noon of his worldly fame, and he seems to have enjoyed it, the recognition, the crowds, the money, the sense of standing at the centre of history, and who could blame him, after the long hard years? And yet it did not last, and could not, and there is something almost like a fable in what came after. The Congress ended, the kings went home, the great whirl subsided, and the Europe that settled into place after all that upheaval was a tired, frightened, reactionary Europe, its rulers determined above all to bury the dangerous dreams of freedom and revolution that had caused so much blood, to clamp down, to censor, to spy, to restore the old order of thrones and hierarchies, as if the great hopes of Beethoven's youth had never been. In his own Vienna, a suffocating web of secret police and censorship settled over everything, and a man had to guard his tongue, and the very ideals the composer had believed in all his life, the freedom, the brotherhood, the dignity of the common man, became things it was unwise to speak of aloud, and Beethoven, the aging deaf revolutionary, watched the bright hopes of his youth put out one by one, and withdrew, as his hearing withdrew, further and further into himself, into his silence and his sketchbooks and his walks and his difficult family griefs, and the fashionable crowd that had cheered his battle-piece drifted off to lighter, newer pleasures, and the great public fame of the Congress years faded, and he was left, in the end, more or less alone with the one thing that had never left him and never would, the music rising up inside the silence. And it was precisely then, cast back out of the glittering public world into his own deaf solitude, that he wrote the very greatest of everything, the Mass, the Ninth Symphony, the last quartets, the immortal things, so that the worldly fame and the immortal work seem almost to trade places, the fame cresting and falling, while the real greatness was being made quietly in the shadows behind it. The crowd cheered the noise and went home. The silence kept the masterpieces. One last room to look into, quietly, before we turn down the final lamp, and it is the most private room of all, the inner life of the man, the beliefs and the thoughts and the great sustaining ideas that kept him upright through everything. Because a person does not endure what he endured on will alone. There has to be something underneath the will, some deep ground to stand on, and Beethoven had one, though it was all his own and fit into no tidy box. He had been raised a Catholic in the Catholic town of a prince archbishop, and he never left the church exactly, and set its ancient words to some of the most profound sacred music ever written, and received its last rites with peace at the end. But his real faith was something larger and stranger and more personal than any single creed, a deep, passionate, almost mystical sense of a divine presence running through all things, and above all through nature, which was for him not merely a pleasure, but a kind of temple, the place where he felt closest to God. He wrote in his private notes things of great simple power about this, that no one could love the country as much as he did, that the woods and the trees and the rocks gave back the answer that a man longs for, that in the countryside it was as if every tree spoke to him, saying, "Holy, holy," walking in the fields was, for him, a form of worship. And the music that came to him there was, he seems genuinely to have felt, a thing given to him from somewhere beyond himself, a message he was privileged to receive and pass on, so that he thought of his own genius not as a personal possession to be proud of, but almost as a sacred duty laid upon him, a gift he was obliged to carry and deliver whatever the cost. And this, more than any stubbornness of temperament, is surely part of why he could not lay it down even when the deafness made the carrying of it a kind of torture. He was a passionate reader all his life, the self-taught boy from the warm house in Bonn, grown into a man who fed his soul on the greatest books he could find. He loved the ancient poets above all, loved Homer, the old blind singer of the Greeks, and read and reread the great tales of the wanderer trying for 10 long years to come home across the wine-dark sea. and there is something fitting in the deaf composer loving the blind poet. The two of them making their immortal art out of the very darkness of a shut door. He loved the plays of Shakespeare, and pored over them, and drew from them some of the storms and the tenderness that pour through his music. And he was drawn, in his thoughtful later years, to the great philosophers of his own age who wrestled with the deepest questions of duty and freedom and the moral order of the universe, and he copied out and kept close to him a famous saying about the two things that fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder the more steadily one considers them: the starry heavens above and the moral law within, the vast order of the cosmos overhead and the still small voice of conscience inside the breast. And you could hardly find a better motto for the man himself, who lived his whole life reaching up toward the stars with his music and holding, underneath everything, with a fierce and unbending grip, to his own inner law of what was right and true and worthy, refusing to bow, refusing to flatter, refusing to make his art smaller or cheaper or more comfortable than his conscience told him it must be. He could be, as we have seen, a difficult and even a cruel man in the ordinary dealings of life, unjust to his friends, disastrous with his nephew, suspicious and quarrelsome and proud. He was no plaster saint, and it does him more honour, not less, to say so plainly, because the greatness is greater, not smaller, for having been achieved by a real and flawed and struggling human being rather than by some serene untroubled angel. But underneath the flaws there ran, always, that deep bedrock of moral seriousness and spiritual longing and love, a genuine, aching, lifelong love of humanity in the large, even when he could barely manage the humans in front of him, a real and burning wish that his art might do people good, might lift them, might comfort them, might make them better and braver and more truly alive. He said once that music should strike fire in the heart of a man and bring tears from the eyes of a woman, that it ought to be a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy, a bridge between the spirit and the divine. And he believed that with his whole being, and he spent his whole life trying to build that bridge, plank by hard-won plank, out over the abyss of his own suffering, so that others might cross it. And the most moving thing of all, perhaps, is that he did most of this bridge building in the certain knowledge that he himself would never walk very far out onto it in comfort, that the recognition and the full understanding of what he had made would come, if it came at all, only after he was gone, that he was working, consciously, for a future he would not see, and for people not yet born. He said as much more than once about the strange, difficult late works that his own contemporaries could not follow, that they were not for now but for a later time, and he was exactly right, and here we are. In that later time he wrote toward across the dark, listening still, comforted still, carried still, by the labour of a man who trusted us, the unknown future, to one day understand what his own age could not. And so we come to the end of the long life, and to the end of our night's walk through it, and there is nothing left to do now but to let it all grow soft and dim and far away, the way the whole world grows soft and dim and far away in the last quiet minutes before sleep. Let the narrow house by the grey river go, let the crying boy on the footstool go, gently, into the past where he is safe now and cannot be hurt any more. Let the great glittering city go, the palaces and the piano jewels and the weeping aristocrats, and the terrible autumn in the quiet village, and the hole torn through the title page, and the sunlit countryside, painted by a man who could no longer hear the brook. Let the letter in the drawer go, and the boy the old man could not save, and the stick clenched between the teeth, and the hand on the sleeve turning him around to see the love he could not hear, and the raised fist in the spring thunder. Let all of it soften and settle and drift down, like snow, like dust, like the last notes of something beautiful fading into a quiet room. He is at peace now, and has been for 200 years, beside the river of a far city, and all the pain of it is long over, and only the gift remains, only the music, still playing, somewhere, everywhere, tonight and every night, for anyone who needs it. You do not have to hold on to any of the names or the dates or the details. They were never the point. They were only the shape of a companionship to keep you company down the long soft slope, and if most of them have already blurred and slipped away, that is exactly as it should be. That is the whole design of it, and the one thing worth keeping, if you keep anything at all, is simply the quiet knowledge that a human being once took the very worst that life can hand a person and, by sheer stubborn love, turned it into something that still gives comfort to strangers in the dark. And that if he could do that, out of his silence, then there is more in each of us and more in this strange difficult world than the hard days would ever let us believe. Are you still awake? If you are, that is all right. There is no hurry, and there is no need to try. Sleep will come in its own time, the way the music came to him, out of the quiet, when it was ready, and not one moment before, and you do not have to chase it, or earn it, or do anything at all to deserve it. And if you are drifting now, right at the edge, half here and half gone, then let yourself go the rest of the way, softly, and do not fight it. And do not worry that you missed the ending, because the story will still be here, patient and unhurried, tomorrow night, and the night after that, and there will be another life waiting on the screen for you whenever you wish to come back, another long quiet life told slowly in the dark. If these long biographies help you find your way down into sleep, you might, only if you truly want to, leave a like or a quiet word below. And tell the others where in the world you are listening from, and what the hour is where you are, because it is a gentle comfort to know that all across the earth, in all the different times, other people are lying in their own quiet dark, listening to the same slow voice, letting the same old story carry them down toward the same soft country of sleep. But that can wait for the morning. All of it can wait for the morning. For now, there is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be, and no one who needs anything from you at all. There is only the dark, and the quiet, and your own slow breathing, and the small warm weight of a good long story now safely told. Let your shoulders come down one last inch. Let the day, whatever it held, be finished. Let the lamp go out, and let the music, that faint remembered glow of it, be the last thing with you as you go. Rest now. You have listened long and well, and you have earned this quiet, and it is yours. Close your eyes and let it all grow still. Good night, and sleep deeply, and sweet, sweet dreams.